Welcome back to the Quiet Apothecary. Take a slow breath in and let it go, and feel the weight of the day begin, at last, to loosen from your shoulders. There is nothing to do tonight, and nowhere to be, and nothing that this hour will ask of you except that you rest and listen and let yourself drift. Tonight we are going back, a very long way back, to a cold green island at the edge of a colder grey sea. In the centuries before the printing press, before the microscope, before anyone in England had ever written the word doctor in their own tongue. We are going back to the England of the Anglo Saxons, to a land of small wooden halls and long winters and low smoky fires, where healing was called leechcraft and the healer was called a leech, not for the small dark creature of the pond that later borrowed the name, but from an old word meaning simply one who heals, one who knows. We are going to sit for a while, this quiet night, in that old world, and gather up its cures the way its own people gathered them, slowly, patiently, one plant and one charm, and one small kindness at a time, and let each one settle over you like a soft grey blanket, pulled a little higher against the cold. There will be no urgency in any of it. Nothing here is a warning, and nothing here is a lesson to be tested on in the morning. It is only a long, slow procession of quiet and curious and gentle facts, the kind of facts that were once whispered over a sickbed by candlelight, or murmured to a child with a hurt wrapped in a piece of clean cloth, and each one is offered to you now the way it was offered then, softly and without any hurry at all. So let your eyes grow heavy whenever they wish to, and let your mind wander in and out of listening, and know that nothing will be lost if you drift away entirely before the last word is spoken. That, in fact, is exactly the point. Let us begin, then, in the world where all of this once lived, the world of the Anglo Saxon leech. For nearly 600 years, from the departure of the Roman legions to the arrival of the Normans, the people who lived in England called themselves the English, or more properly the Angelsyn, the kin of the Angles, and among the many things they carried with them from their older homelands across the North Sea, and absorbed from the Christian missionaries who came to convert them, and borrowed quietly from the Roman and Greek medicine that reached them through monasteries and translated books, was a rich and very particular tradition of healing. It was a tradition built from three things at once, woven so closely together that an Anglo-Saxon healer would hardly have thought to separate them. There was the plant, the actual leaf and root and bark, gathered from the hedgerow or the garden or the wild wood, and known by long observation to ease a fever or close a wound. There was the charm, the spoken word, the small formula of sound that was said over the plant, or over the patient, or over both together, because sound itself was believed to carry power, especially the old alliterative verses that had been carried down from a time before England was Christian at all. And there was the prayer, the quiet appeal to God, or to Christ, or to the Virgin, or to one of the saints, layered gently over the older charm the way frost settles over an autumn field, softening it, but never quite erasing what lay beneath. This blended tradition survives for us today in a small handful of remarkable manuscripts, each written by hand on stretched and scraped animal skin, each copied and recopied by monks working in the dim light of a scriptorium, and each one a kind of quiet miracle simply for having survived 1,000 years of fire, flood, neglect, and the slow decay of age. We will meet 3 of these books tonight, one by one, and let their pages fall open before us the way a careful hand might open them in a quiet library reading room. And we will walk, chapter by chapter, through the plants and the charms and the beliefs that they preserved. We will meet the wise women and the monks who practiced this old craft. We will walk through the Dooryard Gardens, where the useful plants were grown close to the door, within easy reach of a hurried hand. We will sit by the hearth and hear the cures that were made there, in the warm dark, with what was close at hand. We will learn what an elf shot was believed to be, and how a person might be cured of one. We will learn what the church added to the old charms, and what it quietly left alone. We will spend a good while with honey, and with wax, 2 of the gentlest and most useful substances in the whole of the old apothecary's store. And then, toward the end, we will walk slowly through 9 plants that any Anglo Saxon healer would have known by heart, and close with the small, human cures for toothache and fever and the long, difficult night of childbirth. None of it will be frightening, though some of it will be strange to modern ears, and some of it, here and there, will turn out to be wiser than it has any right to be, wise enough that, many centuries later, a laboratory would test one of these old recipes and find, to its own considerable surprise, that it worked. But that is a story for later in the night. For now, let us simply begin gently, the way all good things in this tradition began, with a plant, a name, and a patient hand reaching down to gather it. Let your mind settle now on a single low cottage, built of timber and wattle and daub, with a thatched roof that has gone soft and grey-green with moss, standing at the edge of a fen in the flat, wet country of eastern England, where the mist lies on the low fields most mornings until the sun has properly climbed. It is very early, and the light is the pale, colourless light that comes before true dawn, and a thin line of smoke is rising, straight and unhurried, from the smoke hole in the roof, because the fire inside has been banked all night beneath its covering of ash, and is only now being coaxed gently back into flame. Somewhere close by, hens are beginning to stir. This is the kind of home a village healer might have kept, a place with a small dooryard garden fenced against the goats, a drying rack of bundled herbs hanging from the low rafters inside, and shelves along one wall holding small clay pots and wooden boxes, each one carefully marked, in a mind that could not always read, by shape and by smell, and by long, long familiarity. We will return to this cottage, now and again, throughout the night, as a kind of resting place between the larger chapters of the story. So let it settle now into the back of your mind, quiet and low and softly smoking, waiting for us whenever we wish to come home to it. Let us turn now to the first and grandest of the old books, the one history remembers by the name of a man who almost certainly never held a pen at all. That book is known today as the Leechbook of Bald, or sometimes simply Bald's Leechbook, and it is, without any real competition, the single most important surviving witness to Anglo Saxon medicine. It was written down in the middle of the 900s, most likely somewhere in the circle of scholars and scribes gathered around the court of King Alfred, or his immediate successors, at a time when the English kingdom was still recovering from generations of raiding along its coasts and was, at the same time, in the middle of a real and deliberate flowering of learning, a small, quiet renaissance of books and translation and careful copying that Alfred himself had encouraged in his own lifetime. We know the name Bald only because of a short verse written into the very last page of the book, a kind of ownership note in the old alliterative style, which says in effect that Bald owns this book and that he had it written by a scribe named Salve, and asks that no one take it from him by force or by any trick at all. It is a small, human, slightly anxious little note, the kind of thing anyone might write inside the cover of a treasured possession, and it is almost everything we know about the man for whom one of the great medical books of the early medieval world is named. We do not know if Bald himself was a healer or simply a wealthy man who commissioned the book because he valued the knowledge inside it. We know only that he loved it enough to want it kept safe and safe. Remarkably, it has stayed, surviving into our own century in the collections of the British Library, its pages still readable, its careful brown ink still legible after more than 1,000 winters. The book itself is organized with real, deliberate care, arranged in 3 parts, moving in an order that any modern reader would still find sensible. The first section works its way down the body, beginning with the head and moving gradually toward the feet, gathering cures for headache and eye trouble and toothache and sore throat, then working through chest complaints and stomach complaints and pains of the joints, in the kind of orderly, head-to-foot arrangement that Greek and Roman medical writing had used for centuries, and that had reached the Anglo Saxon compilers through Latin sources copied and passed down through monastery libraries on the continent. The second section turns to internal illness more broadly, to fevers and disorders of what the old medicine called the humours, the 4 fluids of blood and phlegm, and the 2 biles that were believed, in this period across the whole of Europe, to govern the health of the body, according to how well they were balanced within it. And the third section is different in character from the other 2, less formal, more homely, closer in feeling to a family's own gathered wisdom than to a translated textbook, filled with remedies that feel as though they were collected directly from English soil, rather than borrowed from a foreign page. Woven through all 3 sections is a steady presence of real classical learning. The compilers of the Leechbook clearly had access to Latin medical writing, some of it going back, through many hands, to the Greek physicians of the ancient Mediterranean world, and they drew on it freely, translating what they found useful into their own Old English tongue and setting it down beside cures that were purely local and purely their own. It is this blending that makes the book so remarkable to read even now, this sense of a wide, cosmopolitan medical inheritance being folded gently and without any sense of contradiction into the particular plants and particular beliefs of a small island kingdom at the edge of the known world. Among the many hundreds of recipes preserved in the Leechbook, one in particular has, in recent years, found its way out of the quiet world of manuscript scholars and into modern newspapers and modern laboratories. And it is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is exactly the kind of fact that this book was written to offer you, strange and true, and gently astonishing all at once. Tucked into the first section, among the cures for the eyes, is a recipe for what the text calls simply an eye salve, meant for what it describes as a growth or infection troubling the eye. The recipe calls for 2 kinds of allium, garlic and another onion-like plant, to be pounded together, mixed with wine, and with the bile taken from the stomach of a cow, left to stand in a bronze vessel for 9 nights, and then strained through a cloth before being applied gently to the eye with a feather. For 1,000 years this recipe sat quietly on the page, one small cure among thousands, noted by scholars chiefly for its careful, specific instructions and its curious insistence on a bronze container and a wait of exactly 9 nights. Then, in the 2010s, a team of microbiologists working at a university in the English Midlands, curious about whether any of these old plant-based remedies might hold real antimicrobial value, followed the recipe as closely as they were able, using modern versions of each ingredient, and tested the resulting salve against a modern hospital superbug, a strain of staph bacteria that had become resistant to nearly every antibiotic in current use. To the great surprise of nearly everyone involved, the old salve worked, killing the resistant bacteria in laboratory conditions with a consistency that no single one of its ingredients could quite explain on its own, suggesting that something in the particular combination, the garlic and the onion and the wine and the bile, working together in a way that no one in the 10th century could have understood in modern terms, produced a genuinely effective antibacterial treatment. The scientists gave the project a small, gentle nickname, calling their recreated recipe an ancient biotic, and the story traveled quietly around the world, a reminder that patient, careful, centuries-old observation, even without any concept of bacteria at all, could sometimes arrive by a different road entirely at real and useful knowledge. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, here in the quiet, because it says something gentle and rather lovely about the whole tradition we are walking through tonight. The compilers of the Leechbook were not guessing wildly, and they were not simply reciting superstition without any grounding in careful watching. They were working, generation after generation, the way careful people always have, by trying things, and remembering what seemed to help, and writing it down so that the next healer, and the healer after that, would not have to begin again from nothing. Most of their remedies we cannot test in any laboratory, and many of them, we should say honestly, probably did very little at all beyond offering comfort and the simple, real medicine of a calm and attentive hand. But now and then, tucked among the pages, sat a small true thing, waiting patiently for someone, 1,000 years later, to notice. Let your breathing settle a little further now, as we leave the Leechbook resting closed on its shelf, its brown ink quiet in the dark, and turn to a second book, smaller and stranger, and filled with a different kind of medicine altogether. That second book is known to scholars as the Lacnunga, a word that simply means remedies or healings in Old English, and it survives in a single manuscript, now kept in the British Library, copied out around the year 1000 or a little after. Where the Leechbook feels organized and orderly, a book that someone sat down and arranged with real system, the Lacnunga feels more like a private notebook, a gathering of remedies and charms and small useful fragments copied down over time, in something closer to the order in which they were collected than any careful medical scheme. It is shorter than the Leechbook and rougher in places, and for exactly that reason it feels, to many readers, closer to the actual working practice of an ordinary healer, someone who added a new cure to the back pages whenever they learned one worth keeping. rather than sitting down to compose a formal textbook from the very start. The Lacnunga is especially treasured for its charms, the spoken formulas that were meant to be said aloud, sometimes while a remedy was being prepared, sometimes while it was being administered, and sometimes on their own, with no plant at all involved, as pure spoken medicine. One of its charms is addressed against what the text calls a dwar, a word that literally means a dwarf, and scholars have long puzzled gently over what the compiler actually meant by it. The most common reading is that dwar here refers not to a small mythical person in the way the word later came to be used, but to a recurring fever, one that seemed to come and go with a rhythm, arriving and departing, almost as though some small stubborn creature were riding in on the patient's back and then, eventually, climbing down again. The charm against the dwar instructs the healer to take 7 small wafers of a particular kind and to write certain names upon each one, and to sing the charm over the patient first into one ear, then over the head, and then into the other ear, and then to have an unmarried maiden approach the patient and hang the charm about his neck. And it closes with the somewhat startling image of the dwarf being told to harness his sister, presumably meaning some paired affliction, and to flee together over the 9 worlds of the old cosmology, as though the fever itself were being formally evicted, addressed directly, and sent on its way with clear travel instructions. Another remedy preserved in the Lacnunga is aimed against what the text calls wenas, meaning wens or tumours or troublesome swellings under the skin, and it too combines a practical element, a plant preparation applied directly to the swelling, with a spoken charm addressed to the wen itself, commanding it to shrink and diminish, to become smaller than a grain of barley, smaller than the hand of a louse, until at last it becomes nothing at all. There is something very touching in this habit of speaking directly to the illness, as though a stubborn swelling or a persistent fever were a small, wayward creature that might, if addressed firmly and patiently enough, simply agree to leave. It reflects a way of thinking about sickness that modern medicine has largely set aside, the sense that illness has something of a will of its own, an intention, almost a personality, and that healing might therefore include not only physical treatment, but also a kind of respectful, insistent negotiation, healer speaking directly to affliction, asking it, commanding it, coaxing it to depart. The Lacnunga also preserves what is sometimes called the journey charm, or the traveller's blessing, a long protective formula meant to be recited before setting out on any road, invoking, in a single breath, the protection of the cross of Christ, the shield of the archangels, and an older, deeper layer of protective language reaching back to a time before the missionaries arrived at all. It is a lovely example of exactly the blending we spoke of earlier, the old alliterative charm tradition standing comfortably beside the newer Christian prayer, neither one crowding the other out, both offered together as a kind of double insurance against the real dangers of travel on foot or on horseback along the muddy, uncertain roads of early medieval England, where a journey of even a single day might cross through wild woodland, past the territory of outlaws, and over rivers with no bridge at all. But the single most famous piece the Lacnunga preserves, the one that has drawn more attention from modern scholars and modern readers than perhaps any other few hundred words in the whole of Old English literature, is a long and beautiful charm built around 9 specific plants, each one named, each one given its own small verse, and each one bound up with the oldest god of the Old English pantheon. Let us turn to it now, slowly, the way it deserves. The 9 herbs charm is, by any reckoning, one of the most extraordinary survivals of the whole Anglo Saxon period, a piece of writing that manages to be, at the very same time, a practical medical recipe, a fragment of half-remembered mythology, and a genuine poem, with real rhythm and real imagery, the kind of thing that would have been spoken aloud, slowly, with weight given to every line. It opens not with a plant at all, but with a story, a short account of how the god Woden, the same figure who would later be remembered in Norse tradition as Odin, once struck a serpent with 9 glory twigs, and how the serpent, in dying, broke into 9 parts, and how from those 9 parts came, in some fashion the charm does not fully explain, the 9 herbs that follow, each one now carrying within it a portion of that old power, whatever the precise mythology behind it once was, and much of it has been lost or blurred by the centuries and by the layer of Christian language added over the top. The effect of the opening is to place the 9 plants that follow into a story far larger than any single sickbed, a story of gods and serpents and old cosmic struggle, before bringing that same power gently down into a bowl, a hand, and a single suffering patient. The 9 herbs are named one after another, each given its own short address, as though the healer were greeting each plant in turn and reminding it of its own history and its own strength. The first named, and clearly the most honored of the 9, is mugwort, called in the charm the oldest of worts, the mother of herbs, said to have power over 3 and against 30, a plant with a reach, in other words, far beyond the single patient in front of the healer. The second is waybread, which we would today call plantain, the low, broad-leaved weed that grows along paths and trodden ground almost everywhere in England, and which the charm calls the mother of worts, open to the east, mighty within, a plant so common underfoot that it is easy to miss how deeply it was once trusted. The third is a plant called stoon in the old text, whose modern identity scholars still debate quietly among themselves, some favoring a kind of watercress, others a low-growing plant of damp ground, and it is addressed in the charm as a plant that grows on stone, standing against poison, and it is a small, honest reminder that even careful, patient scholarship cannot always recover everything the old healers knew. The fourth herb is called a torlaith in the text, a name that seems to mean quite directly poison loather or venom hater, and it is invoked specifically against venom and against flying, wafting evil. And though its exact modern identity is again debated, the sense of its purpose is entirely clear. The fifth is mathen, which we would call chamomile, gathered by the charm alongside the plant before it as a pair, and prized then, as it still is now, for the particular softness of its effect, a gentling herb rather than a harsh one. The sixth is wurgaloo, most likely the common nettle, a plant that stings the hand that gathers it carelessly, and yet was trusted, prepared correctly, as a genuine remedy. A small lesson in itself about how the plants that hurt us are so often, if we are patient with them, also the plants that help us. The seventh is the crab apple, addressed in the charm with real tenderness as a small wild fruit against poison and against infection. Its sour flesh valued long before the sweeter grafted apples of later centuries, became common in English orchards. The 8th and 9th are named together, chervil and fennel, described in the charm as two very great powers, created by the wise Lord as he hung in the heavens, holy in the heavens, where he set them and sent them into all the 7 worlds, to the poor and to the rich alike, a remedy for all, standing always against pain, a beautiful closing image of 2 humble kitchen herbs elevated, within the charm's own logic, to the level of a gift set down for all of humankind together, poor and rich receiving exactly the same medicine from exactly the same hand. Once all 9 plants have been named and honored, the charm turns to instruction, describing how the 9 herbs are to be pounded together into a paste, mixed with soap and the juice of an apple, and how the whole preparation is to be worked into a salve, boiled and stirred with the ashes of certain other herbs added into it, before being applied to the wound or the illness, while a version of the charm is sung over it, 3 times over each nostril, and again over the wound itself, and once more into the wind, the open air, as though the words needed to travel outward as well as inward to do their full work. The charm addresses itself, at various points, against what it calls the flying venom, and against 9 venoms and 9 flying evils, and against the loathsome one that goes through the land, imagery that scholars believe reflects a genuine old belief in illness as something that traveled, something that moved through the air or across the land from one victim to the next, carried on wind or shot from a distance. An idea we will return to a little later tonight, when we speak of elf shot. What makes the 9 herbs charm so quietly moving to read even now, so many centuries after it was first spoken aloud over some particular, now nameless patient in some particular, now vanished hall, is the way it holds together, without any apparent strain, things that a modern mind tends to keep carefully separate. It is herbal pharmacy, and it is mythology, and it is poetry, and it is prayer, all at once, in the very same breath, and it asks its listener to accept all of it together, the practical pounding of real plants in a real bowl, and the grand old story of a god and a 9-part serpent, and the simple human hope that a suffering person, lying in the dark of a small hall on a cold night, might soon feel a little better. There is no contradiction felt anywhere in it, because in the world that produced it, there was no contradiction to feel. Medicine, story, and prayer were simply 3 names for the same careful, hopeful human act of trying to help. Let your shoulders soften a little further now, as the charm falls quiet, and let us turn from the great books themselves to the people who actually put this knowledge to use, day after day, in halls and cottages up and down the length of England. The knowledge held inside these manuscripts did not belong only to a narrow class of trained physicians in the way that later, more formal medicine would come to be organized. Anglo Saxon healing was practiced, at different levels and in different settings, by a fairly wide range of people, and it is worth taking a little time to picture who they actually were, because it changes how the whole tradition feels to imagine. At one end stood the monks, working within the walls of the growing number of monasteries that dotted the English landscape from the 7th century onward, places like Canterbury and Winchester. And, a little later, the great houses of the Benedictine reform. Monasteries were, among their many other functions, the chief centres of literacy in the whole of England for most of this period, and it was largely within their libraries and their scriptoria that Latin medical texts from the classical and late antique world were preserved, copied, and gradually translated into the English tongue. A monastery typically kept its own infirmary, a quiet building set a little apart from the main cloister, where sick or aging brothers could be tended. And attached to many monasteries was a physic garden, a carefully tended plot growing the specific herbs that Latin medical tradition called for, plants like rue and southernwood and lovage that had been brought originally from warmer, more southern lands and were cultivated with real care in the cooler English climate, tended by a monk whose particular duty this was, sometimes called the Herbarius, whose quiet daily work of weeding and watering and harvesting kept the monastery's whole store of remedies supplied. At the other end of the social world, in nearly every village too small and too poor to have any monastery nearby, stood a very different kind of healer, usually a woman, known to her neighbors simply by reputation rather than by any formal title, a wise woman, sometimes remembered later as a cunning woman, whose knowledge had been passed to her, most often, by an older woman before her, mother to daughter, or aunt to niece, or simply neighbor to apprentice, across an unbroken chain of memory that left no written record at all. It was this woman who knew which plant to press against a burn, which to steep for a child's cough, which to boil into a poultice for a wound that would not close, and her knowledge, though it has left far fewer traces in the surviving manuscripts than the monastery tradition, was very likely deeper and more varied in its actual plant lore, since she worked directly with the land around her own village year after year, watching what grew where and when and how it behaved when applied to one complaint after another. Midwifery, in particular, belonged almost entirely to this world of women's knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, with almost no involvement from the male, Latin literate, monastery-centered medical tradition at all, and the herbs and charms used to ease childbirth, which we will come to later tonight, survive for us today only in scattered fragments, hints of a much larger body of knowledge that was simply never thought worth writing down by the men who held the pens. Between these two poles stood a whole range of other practitioners, itinerant healers, who traveled from village to village, offering their skills for a meal and a place by the fire, the occasional literate priest in a country parish, who kept a little medical knowledge alongside his spiritual duties, and the ordinary heads of households, who were themselves expected to know a reasonable working stock of home remedies, since calling in outside help of any kind, whether monk or wise woman or traveling healer, cost time, and often cost payment in coin or in kind, and was not something a family reached for lightly. This meant that a very great deal of Anglo Saxon medicine was, in the most literal sense, folk medicine, knowledge held not by specialists at all, but by ordinary people, passed down inside families the way a recipe for bread or a method of thatching a roof was passed down, practical, unglamorous, and utterly essential. Underlying all of these different practitioners, whether monk or wise woman or ordinary householder, was a shared body of belief about what a plant actually was and what gave it its power, a way of thinking sometimes called Wortlore, from the old word wort, meaning simply plant or root, the same old word that survives today, almost unchanged, in names like mugwort and liverwort, and the familiar St. John's wort. To know Wortlore was to know far more than which plant cured which complaint. It was to know when a plant should be gathered, since the same root, pulled from the earth in spring, might be considered weak and watery compared to the same root pulled in late autumn, its strength drawn down and concentrated after a full season of growth. It was to know how a plant should be prepared, whether dried in the rafters or used fresh, whether steeped in cold water or boiled, whether ground to a paste or hung whole about the neck. And it was to know, too, the words that properly belonged with a given plant, the small formula or blessing that a careful healer would speak while gathering it or preparing it or handing it over to the patient, because a plant taken up carelessly, without the proper respect and the proper words, was widely believed to lose at least some part of its power. As though the medicine lived not only in the leaf and the root, but also in the whole careful ceremony of gathering and giving. Let us walk out now, together, into the low fields and hedgerows where that gathering actually took place, and learn something of how it was done. The gathering of a healing plant, in this old English tradition, was very rarely a quick or careless act, snatched between other tasks. The manuscripts that preserve it, along with the wider folk custom that survived long after them in later centuries, describe a whole small ceremony built around the moment, one that varied from plant to plant, but shared a common shape. Certain herbs were to be gathered only at dawn, while the dew still lay heavy on the leaf, since the dew itself was believed to carry something of the plant's freshest strength before the sun had drawn it upward and away. Certain others were to be gathered only in silence, the gatherer moving through the field or garden without speaking a single word, until the plant was safely in hand, on the belief that idle chatter might scatter the very virtue the gatherer had come to collect. A very great number of remedies specify that the plant should be pulled with the left hand rather than the right, or that it should be approached from a particular direction, or that the gatherer should look toward the sun or away from it, depending on the plant and the illness it was meant to treat. Small physical rituals that gave the whole act of harvesting a weight and a deliberateness that a modern reader might easily mistake for simple superstition, but which functioned, in their own context, as a way of concentrating the gatherer's full attention on the task, ensuring that the right plant, in the right condition, was chosen with real care rather than picked in haste. The moon, too, held a real and steady place in this practice, as it did across nearly every folk medical tradition in medieval Europe. Plants gathered as the moon waxed, growing fuller night by night, were widely held to carry a rising, strengthening virtue, well suited to remedies meant to build up a weakened patient, while plants gathered as the moon waned were considered better suited to remedies meant to draw something out or down, a fever, a swelling, an infection, following it out of the body the way the moon itself seemed to be following its own light out of the sky. Some of the oldest charms specify precise timing beyond even this, calling for a plant to be gathered before sunrise on a particular day or during a particular phase of a particular month, timing that modern readers can no longer always reconstruct with confidence, since the exact old calendar reckoning behind many of these instructions has been lost along with so much else, but the underlying instinct that the same plant is not always equally strong, that its virtue rises and falls with time and season and the turning sky above it, was held with real conviction, and is not, in fact, so very far from the modern botanical observation that the concentration of active compounds within a given plant genuinely does shift across its growing season. Before the actual pulling or cutting of the plant, many of the surviving charms instruct the gatherer to speak a short address to the plant itself, sometimes naming it directly, sometimes simply thanking the earth from which it grew, and a number of these small addresses have survived, preserved almost by accident, folded into the margins of the larger medical manuscripts. One widely cited example, addressed to the earth itself before a plant is taken from it, calls upon the earth as a mother of all growing things, asking her blessing on the herb, about to be gathered and promising, in a kind of small unwritten bargain, that the plant will be used only for good and only for healing. It is a lovely small moment of courtesy extended toward the natural world, a request for permission rather than a simple act of taking, and it reflects a way of relating to plants that treated them, at least in this ceremonial moment, as something closer to living partners in the work of healing than as mere inert material to be harvested without a second thought. Once gathered, the plant's onward journey depended entirely on what it was and what it was meant to treat. Some were used fresh, bruised or pounded in a small stone or wooden mortar and applied directly, as a poultice, to a wound or a swelling. Others were dried, hung in loose bundles from the low rafters of the cottage or the monastery infirmary, where the smoke from the hearth fire, rising slowly upward through the thatch, helped to preserve them against damp, and mowed through the long wet English winter, ready to be taken down, crumbled, and steeped in hot water or wine or oil whenever the need arose. A great many remedies called for a plant to be boiled together with other ingredients into a thick paste or salve, bound with animal fat or with wax, which could then be kept for weeks or months in a small clay pot, sealed and labelled. If the healer could write or simply remembered, if she could not, by shape and colour and smell. And a smaller but still significant number of plants were used in neither of these ways at all, but were instead worn, sewn into a small pouch and hung about the neck, or tied about the waist or the wrist, trusted to protect or to heal simply by their nearness to the body, without ever being eaten, drunk, or applied directly to any wound. It is worth pausing, before we move on, to notice how much patient, close observation of the natural world underlies all of this ceremony. However strange some of its particular details may sound to modern ears. To know that a plant's strength shifts with the season, to know that damp destroys a dried herb's usefulness while dry storage preserves it, to know which combinations of plants seem, by repeated trial, to ease which complaints. All of this required generations of careful watching, passed down and refined family by family, village by village, long before anyone had a word for the scientific method at all, the ceremony and the science. In this old tradition, were never really separate things. They were simply two names for the same slow, careful, deeply attentive way of living alongside the plants that fed and healed you. Let your breathing slow a little further, and let us walk now, together, through the low wooden gate of a dooryard garden, the small fenced plot that stood, in this old world, closest of all to the healer's own front door. Every Anglo Saxon home of any size Whether a small village cottage or a monastery infirmary or the hall of a minor lord, kept, wherever it could, a small enclosed garden close to the door, fenced against the wandering goats and pigs that shared the wider yard, planted with the handful of herbs that were needed often enough and urgently enough to make a longer walk out to the hedgerow or the wild wood simply impractical. This was the Dooryard Garden, and though none survive today for us to walk through directly, since even a stone-built hall has long since crumbled and a wattle fence rots away within a single generation, we can reconstruct a fairly confident picture of what grew inside one from the plants, named again and again, across the surviving medical texts, and from the slightly later, better documented monastic garden plans that preserve the same core stock of useful plants. Rue held an honored place in many of these gardens, a strong-smelling blue-green, feathery-leaved plant brought originally from the warmer Mediterranean world and cultivated carefully in the cooler English climate, valued as a remedy against poison, against eye trouble, and, taken with real caution, against a wide range of internal complaints, though the old texts themselves are careful to note that too great a quantity could do real harm. An early and quite practical understanding that a medicine and a poison were often simply a matter of correct measure. Sage grew alongside it in many gardens, its name itself, reaching back through Latin, carrying the sense of health or salvation, and it was trusted for the throat, for the digestion, and ground into a paste with a little salt for cleaning and whitening the teeth, a use that has scarcely changed in the many centuries since. Fennel and dill, close cousins with their feathery leaves and their warm, faintly sweet seed, were kept close at hand for troubles of the stomach and for easing the wind and colic that so often afflicted infants, and dill in particular carried, in the old tongue, an association with soothing and calming, a sense preserved even now in the modern word dilly, meaning to lull or to quiet. Betony held a reputation in this period that went well beyond its actual, modest medicinal effects, prized so widely and so highly that a much later English proverb would advise a person in poor health to sell his cow and buy Betony instead, a plant credited with easing headache, settling the nerves, and, in the layered belief of the age, offering real protection against evil influence and bad dreams alike. It was often grown deliberately near the door of the house or the churchyard gate for exactly this reason, valued as much for its watchful presence as for any tea brewed from its leaves. Comfrey, sometimes called boneset or knitbone in later English folk speech, was trusted above nearly every other plant in the garden for wounds, and for broken bones its thick, mucilaginous sap applied directly to a break or a deep cut, where it was believed. And modern chemistry has since shown this trust to have real grounding, to encourage the wound to close and the bone to knit more quickly than it otherwise would, thanks to a compound within the plant that genuinely does support the body's own healing of damaged tissue. Southernwood, with its soft, silvery, feathery foliage and its sharp, slightly bitter, faintly citrus scent, was grown for coughs and chest complaints, and was also, in a use that says something gentle about how thoroughly plants and daily life were woven together in this period, kept dried and scattered among stored linen and clothing to discourage moths, a single plant serving both as medicine cabinet and household pest control at once. Wormwood, related to mugwort and just as bitter, was steeped to expel the intestinal worms that were a genuine and constant trouble in a world without modern sanitation, and was also, in time, put to a very different use, becoming, many centuries later, the bittering herb behind the drink absinthe. Though in the Anglo Saxon period, it remained purely and simply medicine. Elder deserves its own careful mention, since it stood a little apart from the smaller garden herbs, a proper tree or large shrub, often planted deliberately at the very edge of the dooryard, rather than within it, and treated, in Anglo Saxon and in the much later English folklore that grew directly out of this older tradition, with a degree of respect that shaded very close to genuine reverence. The elder was widely believed to house a guardian spirit, sometimes called the elder mother in later English folk speech, and no branch was to be cut, and certainly no whole tree was to be felled, without first asking the tree's permission aloud, a small spoken request offered before the knife was ever raised. Handled with this proper courtesy, the elder gave generously in return. Its white spring blossoms, steeped in hot water, made a gentle remedy for fever and for the early stages of a cold, while its dark late summer berries, cooked and strained, were kept through the winter as both food and medicine, valued for chest and throat complaints during exactly the cold, damp months when such complaints were most common. The wood itself, harder and denser than its slender branches suggest, was avoided for use inside the house. Out of a lingering caution that ran through the folklore for a very long time, that to burn elder wood on the hearth was to risk bringing genuine misfortune down upon the household, a small quiet rule that outlived, by many centuries, most of the specific beliefs that had first given rise to it. Beyond these particular plants stood a wider ring of more ordinary garden herbs, chamomile with its small white daisy-like flowers and its gentle, calming effect, lovage with its strong celery-like scent, and parsley, brought like rue and sage originally from warmer lands and gradually settled into ordinary English cultivation, valued for the stomach and ground finely for freshening the breath. Together, this small fenced patch of ground, tended daily, weeded by hand, watched over through every turn of the season, represented the working core of the household's whole medicine chest, close enough to the door that a plant could be gathered in a hurry, in the middle of a cold night, by the light of a single rush candle, when a child's fever rose suddenly, and there was no time at all to walk further afield. Let us step back inside now, through the low door, and sit for a while beside the hearth itself, where a rather different, homelier kind of cure was made. The hearth stood at the center of nearly every Anglo-Saxon home, not merely a place for cooking, but the true warm heart of the whole household, and it was here, in the low orange light of the banked fire, that a great many of the simplest and most homely cures of the entire tradition were actually made, blended together from whatever combination of dried herb and honey and warmed oil and animal fat happened to already be close at hand within the house itself. A warm posset was very likely the single most common home remedy of the entire period, a simple drink made by curdling warmed milk or oil with a little vinegar or wine, sweetened with honey, and very often flavored with a pinch of ginger or a scraping of the more costly spices, when the household could afford them, offered to almost anyone feeling unwell, whether the complaint was a chill, a cough, a troubled stomach, or simple exhaustion after a hard day's labor. It was, in the gentlest and most literal sense, a comfort drink, valued as much for its warmth and its sweetness, and the simple ritual of preparing it and sitting quietly to drink it, as for any specific medicinal action within its ingredients, though the honey itself, as we will discuss more fully a little later tonight, does carry real, measurable healing properties of its own. For a cough or a tight, congested chest, horehound was among the most trusted of hearth remedies, a bitter, wrinkled-leaved plant boiled into a strong tea. Its bitterness often softened with a generous spoonful of honey, and this particular combination, bitter herb and sweet honey together, proved so useful and so pleasant that it survived, in only slightly altered form, for well over 1,000 years, eventually giving rise to the horehound cough drops and cough syrups still sold in some old-fashioned chemist shops today, a direct, unbroken thread running from an Anglo Saxon cottage hearth all the way to a modern pharmacy shelf. For a fever, elderflower tea, as we have already heard, was warmed and offered freely, along with the advice, given in this period exactly as it is given now, to rest, to stay warm, and to drink plenty of liquid, simple and sound guidance that needed no laboratory at all to discover, only patient generations of watching, what genuinely seemed to help a feverish body recover. Poultices, too, were made routinely at the hearth, a soft, warm, moist mass of crushed or boiled plant material, sometimes bound together with a little oatmeal or bread to help it hold its shape, wrapped in a clean piece of linen, and pressed warm against a wound, a swelling, or an aching joint. Comfrey, cabbage leaves softened briefly over the fire, and crushed yarrow were all common choices for this purpose, applied and changed regularly until the trouble began, hopefully, to ease. For a burn, a very common household injury in a world where every family cooked over an open flame, dock leaves and the cooling juice of the house leek, a thick fleshy plant often deliberately grown on the thatched roof itself, were both reached for at once, applied gently to draw the heat from the skin. Warm mile, sometimes mulled with a little honey, and whatever warming spice the household could afford, was offered as a general strengthening drink to the weak, the elderly, and the recovering, and warmed animal fat. Most often rendered from a pig, was worked into salves for chapped skin, for chest complaints when rubbed onto the skin of the breast and throat, and for the everyday cracks and roughness that came in a world of hard outdoor labor and cold running water to nearly everyone's hands by the middle of a long winter. What comes through most clearly, sitting with all of these small hearthside remedies together, is how deeply ordinary and how deeply practical this level of the tradition really was. There was no manuscript needed for a warm posset or a horehound tea, no monk's careful Latin translation, no charm sung in 3 directions over the patient's head. This was simply the accumulated, patient knowledge of ordinary households, tested and passed down, mother to daughter and father to son, across countless quiet evenings beside the fire, and it forms, in many ways, the deepest and most enduring layer of the whole Anglo-Saxon medical tradition, the layer that outlasted the manuscripts themselves, carrying on in unbroken practice for centuries after the Norman conquest brought an entirely different written medical tradition into England, quietly persisting in cottage kitchens long after Bald's own great book had been shelved, forgotten, and left to gather the dust of centuries. Let your body settle a little deeper now into wherever you are resting, and let us turn gently to a stranger and more unsettling belief that ran alongside all of this practical, hearthside wisdom, the old idea of the elf shot. Alongside every plant-based, sensible, patiently observed remedy we have walked through tonight, the Anglo Saxons also held a set of beliefs about the deeper, unseen causes of illness. Beliefs that a modern listener might call supernatural, but which felt, to the people who held them, simply like an honest account of how the world actually worked. Chief among these was the idea of elf shot, the belief that certain sudden, sharp, otherwise unexplainable pains, a stabbing ache in the back, a sharp cramping in the side, a limb that went suddenly weak or numb, might be caused by an invisible arrow or dart, shot silently from a distance by an elf, one of the unseen beings that Anglo-Saxon belief held to inhabit the wilder, less settled corners of the landscape, the deep woods, the barrows and burial mounds of an even older people, the lonely hilltops and the marshy fen edges. This was not, in the world view of the time, a fanciful or a foolish idea, but a genuinely reasonable way of accounting for exactly the kind of pain that arrives without any visible wound, without any fall or blow or injury that the patient or those around them can point to and explain. If a person walking calmly across a field is suddenly struck by a sharp pain in the back with no apparent cause at all, and if flint arrowheads, left behind by peoples many centuries older than the Anglo-Saxons themselves, were regularly turning up in the region's fields and pastures, small, sharp, worked stones with no obvious explanation for how they came to be scattered across the ordinary English countryside, it is not so very difficult to see how the two observations might be woven together into a single, coherent, if invisible, cause. These old flint points came in time to be known in English folklore as elf bolts or elf shot themselves, gathered up and kept in later centuries as protective charms precisely because they were believed to be the very darts that had once caused such harm and were thought, held close, to offer some protection against being struck by another. The most vivid and most beautiful surviving description of an elf shot attack comes to us in the charm known today as Wið Færstice, meaning simply against a sudden stitch or a sudden stabbing pain, preserved in the very same Lacnunga manuscript that gave us the 9 herbs charm. The charm describes, in genuinely striking poetic imagery, a company of mighty women riding across a hill, loud as they came, fierce of will, hurling their spears down upon the land below, and it is against exactly this attack, the invisible spear of an elf or a witch or one of these mysterious riding women, that the charm offers its defense. The healer speaking the charm claims to stand against the spear, to turn it back, to blunt it, addressing the attacking force directly and telling it with real defiant confidence that if it was an elf's shot or a witch's shot or a god's shot, it shall now be undone and the patient made whole again. The treatment prescribed alongside the spoken words was entirely practical and entirely herbal, calling for fever few and a particular red variety of nettle that had grown up through the floor of the house itself, and plantain, boiled together in butter and applied as a salve. Exactly the kind of grounded, plant-based preparation we have walked through several times already tonight, offered here not instead of the charm, but fully alongside it. The physical medicine and the spoken defense working together as two halves of a single, complete treatment. This is, in fact, the pattern across nearly all of the elf-related charms that survive, and it is worth noticing clearly, because it tells us something important about how this belief actually functioned in daily practice. The Anglo Saxon healer confronted with a patient in sudden pain did not abandon herbal treatment in favor of pure incantation. She reached for both together, treating the visible, physical symptom with the plants and preparations that long observation had shown to ease pain and swelling, while also addressing, through the spoken charm, the unseen cause that the physical treatment alone could not reach. Elves were not, in this tradition, understood as uniformly malevolent creatures bent on harm. Anglo-Saxon belief held a much more layered and ambiguous view of them, closer to the fair folk of later English and Irish and Scottish folklore than to any simple demon, capable of beauty, and even of a kind of dangerous glamour or fascination, as readily as of harm. And elf-related trouble in the surviving charms covers a wider range than sudden physical pain alone, extending to certain kinds of madness or confusion, to nightmares, and to a category of illness sometimes described as elf sickness more broadly, a general wasting or troubling of the mind and body attributed to unwanted elvish influence or presence. The night itself, and particularly the deep, silent hours after the fire had burned down to embers, was widely felt to be the time when such unseen influences moved most freely, and a range of small protective customs, hanging particular herbs above the bed, or laying a blade quietly beneath the pillow, or simply making the sign of the cross before sleep, grew up around this belief, offering the household a small, comforting sense of an ordinary defense raised against an extraordinary and largely invisible danger. It would be easy for a modern listener to hear all of this and feel only distance from it, a quaint old superstition safely left behind by later, more scientific centuries. But there is something worth holding on to here as well, a kind of deep human honesty in it. The Anglo-Saxons lived, as we all still do, with pain that arrives suddenly and without visible cause, and rather than simply enduring it in silent confusion, they built around it a whole rich structure of story and explanation and active response, something to say, something to do, some way of standing, however imperfectly, against the felt reality of unexplained suffering. That impulse to meet pain with story and with action rather than with silence is very old and very human, and it has never entirely left us, even now, even here in this quiet dark room. However many centuries and however many advances in medicine now stand between us and that old fen-edged cottage where the charm was first spoken. Let your breath settle further still, and let us turn now to what happened when the old church, arriving gradually across these same centuries, encountered this whole world of charm and belief, and what it chose, in the end, to keep. Christianity arrived in England gradually, beginning at the very end of the 6th century, with the mission sent by Pope Gregory and led by Augustine to the Kingdom of Kent, and spreading, over the following 100 years or so, kingdom by kingdom, until the whole of England could be counted, at least nominally, a Christian land. This was not a sudden replacement of one entire way of thinking by another, arriving overnight and sweeping the old beliefs cleanly away, but a long, slow, patient layering, one tradition settling gradually over the top of another, and nowhere is that layering more visible or more gently fascinating than in the surviving medical charms, where a modern reader can watch almost line by line in places, the exact moment where an old alliterative formula, reaching back to a time before any missionary had ever set foot on English soil, gives way to a Latin prayer, or a line invoking Christ, or the sign of the cross, folded in as though it had always belonged there. The Church's actual response to the older charm tradition was considerably less hostile, in practice, than a modern listener might expect. There were certainly voices among the clergy across these centuries who worried openly about charms that seemed to call on old gods by name, or that relied on formulas whose meaning had been half forgotten, and which therefore could not be fully vouched for as properly Christian in content, and church councils occasionally issued warnings against certain kinds of divination, or against charms judged too closely bound up with the old pagan cosmology. But the wholesale rejection of charm medicine that a stricter modern imagination might picture simply did not happen. Instead, what happened, again and again, across the surviving texts, was adaptation. A charm that had once invoked Woden by name might be quietly rewritten, the god's name replaced with Christ's, or with God the Father, the structure and rhythm of the old formula left almost entirely intact, only its central figure exchanged for a more properly Christian one. A charm meant to be said 3 times over a wound might have the sign of the cross added at each repetition, a small physical gesture layered onto an older verbal practice, so that the charm became, in its finished form, neither purely pagan nor purely Christian, but something new, built from both traditions at once, offered without any apparent sense that this blending was strange or improper. Monasteries themselves, rather than opposing herbal and charm-based healing, became in practice some of its most important custodians, precisely because they were also the centers of literacy, where such things could be written down and preserved at all. It is worth remembering, in fact, that every single one of the manuscripts we have discussed tonight, the Leechbook, the Lacnunga, and the great charm we walked through earlier, survives only because monks took the trouble to copy them out, by hand, letter by careful letter, onto expensive prepared parchment, a considerable investment of time and material that a monastery would not have made for material it considered dangerous or improper. Monastic infirmaries blended prayer and herbal treatment as a matter of ordinary daily practice, and it became entirely normal for a psalm to be recited, or a mass to be said, over a preparation of herbs, before it was administered to a sick patient, the spiritual and the physical treatment offered together, in the same quiet spirit that the older pagan charm and the herbal poultice had once been offered together, only now with the words of the Church standing in the place the old alliterative verse had once held. Holy water found a wide range of medical uses across this period, sprinkled over a sick patient, mixed into a drink, or used to wash a wound, understood as carrying a genuine healing property of its own, blessed and set apart, and the water in which a relic, some fragment of bone or cloth associated with a particular saint, had been briefly dipped or washed, was considered still more potent again, sought after, and, where a wealthy or well-connected patient could arrange it, paid for with real devotion. Certain saints came over these centuries to be particularly associated with particular ailments or particular kinds of suffering, prayed to directly for relief in a pattern that would continue, largely unchanged in its basic shape, for the whole of the medieval period that followed, saint invoked for eye trouble, another for the pains of childbirth, another for protection of travelers on the road, each one taking up, in a Christian idiom, something very close to the role that particular old charms or particular older protective customs had once filled on their own. It is genuinely difficult, reading these blended texts now, 1,000 years later, to draw a clean line anywhere within them and say with confidence, here the old religion ends, and here the new one begins. A charm might open with a line invoking the earth as mother of all growing things, in language that reaches back clearly toward the pre-Christian reverence for the natural world we heard earlier tonight, and close, only a few lines later, with an appeal to Christ and to the saints, phrased in careful, orthodox Latin borrowed directly from the Church's own liturgy, and the whole thing was very likely spoken, by whoever used it, as a single, seamless, entirely coherent act of healing, with no sense at all that two different worlds of belief were being awkwardly stitched together. They were not two worlds to the person speaking the charm. They were simply the accumulated, inherited wisdom of her own people, offered whole, in whatever combination experience had shown, over many generations, to bring the greatest comfort and the greatest hope of recovery to whoever lay sick before her. This gentle, patient layering of old and new is, in its own quiet way, one of the loveliest things this whole tradition has to offer a modern listener, a reminder that belief and practice rarely change by sudden replacement, clean and total, but far more often by slow accumulation, one tradition folding itself carefully around another, each new layer honoring, in its own particular way, the deep human needs that the layer beneath it had always been trying to answer, the need to explain suffering, the need to act against it, and the need, always, underneath every charm and every prayer and every carefully gathered herb, simply to offer comfort to someone who is afraid and in pain and hoping very much to be made well again. Let your mind rest now on something sweeter, something that runs through nearly every remedy we have heard tonight, without our ever quite pausing to notice it, waiting patiently in its own small jar upon the shelf. Honey held a place in Anglo Saxon life that went far beyond simple sweetness, valued as food, as medicine, as preservative, and as the raw material for the most important alcoholic drink of the whole culture, and it is worth spending a good, unhurried while with it now, since scarcely a remedy we have heard tonight, from the posset by the hearth to the salve of the 9 herbs charm, was made without it somewhere close at hand. Bees themselves were kept with real, careful attention across Anglo-Saxon England, their hives, called skeps, woven from coils of straw bound with split bramble or willow, set in a sheltered corner of the dooryard or the monastery garden, close enough to be watched over, but positioned, where possible, with some care for the prevailing wind and the angle of the morning sun. The keeping of bees was governed by its own body of custom and law, distinct in character from the herbal charms we have heard so far, but woven from exactly the same instinct, that a working relationship with the natural world required courtesy, attention, and a kind of ongoing respect. Anglo-Saxon law codes, the same legal texts that set out fines and compensation for far graver matters, took the trouble to specify penalties for the theft of a hive, treating bees as valuable, genuinely owned property, worth the law's serious attention. A particular custom grew up around the bees that would prove remarkably long-lived, surviving, in scattered pockets of rural England, all the way into the 19th century, and even, here and there, into living memory within the last 100 years. This was the custom of telling the bees, the belief that a hive needed to be kept properly informed of significant happenings within the household. It belonged to a birth, a marriage, and above all a death, lest the bees, feeling themselves slighted or forgotten, grow offended, sicken, or simply leave the hive altogether in the night. When a member of the household died, it fell to someone, often the widow or another close relative, to walk out to the hive and speak the news aloud, gently, formally, sometimes draping the skep itself with a small scrap of black cloth in a quiet echo of the mourning clothes worn by the human household, and sometimes leaving a small offering of funeral cake or wine beside the hive as well. Whether this particular custom, in its fully developed later form, reaches back in every detail to the Anglo Saxon period itself is difficult to say with full certainty, since our clearest written descriptions of it come from centuries later. But the underlying instinct it reflects, that the bees were valued members of the household in their own right, deserving of courtesy and inclusion rather than mere exploitation, sits comfortably within everything else we know of how this culture related to the useful, working parts of its natural world, extending to the small striped insect the very same careful respect it extended to the healing herb and the felled tree. Honey's practical medical uses ran through nearly the entire body of surviving remedies. It was used, exactly as we heard beside the hearth, to sweeten bitter herbal draughts, making medicines that might otherwise have been refused, particularly by a sick child, palatable enough to actually be taken. It was mixed into salves and ointments as both a binding agent and an active ingredient in its own right, applied directly to wounds and burns, where it was trusted, correctly as it turns out, to keep the injury clean and to encourage it to heal, since honey, thick, low in available moisture, and mildly acidic, creates conditions genuinely hostile to a very wide range of the bacteria that cause wound infection, a property modern medicine has rediscovered and now uses deliberately in specially prepared medical-grade honey dressings applied in hospitals and clinics to this day, a direct, remarkable continuity between the Leechbook's honey salves and a bandage a modern nurse might reach for. It was taken for sore throats and persistent coughs, exactly as a great many households still take it today, warmed gently or stirred into a hot drink, and it was valued too, simply as a source of concentrated nourishment for a patient too weak or too unwell to manage much solid food, offering real, easily absorbed energy at exactly the moment the body most needed it. Beyond its direct medical use, honey was, of course, the sweetener of an entire cuisine that otherwise had no other reliable source of sweetness at all, since refined sugar, imported from far away and enormously expensive, remained essentially unknown in England for many centuries yet. And it was honey, above everything else, that made mid the fermented, sweet, faintly golden drink that held a place of real ceremonial and social importance across Anglo Saxon culture, poured and shared in the hall on feast days, praised in surviving poetry, and associated in the literature of the period with hospitality, celebration, and the particular warmth of community gathered together around a shared fire and a shared cup. A weaker version of mead, sometimes called small mead, brewed with a lower proportion of honey and correspondingly gentler in its effect, was given more freely to the sick and the weak, and even, on occasion, to children, valued as a nourishing, gently fortifying drink rather than as an intoxicant at all. There is something quietly fitting, sitting with all of this tonight, in the way that honey moves so easily across every single category of use we have discussed: medicine, food, drink, and even through the small, careful custom of telling the bees, a genuine thread of relationship and respect extended toward the creatures who made it. It asks almost nothing of the plants it depends on beyond their flowers, and it gives back, in return, something sweet enough to make the bitterest medicine bearable, strong enough to help a wound close cleanly, and warm enough, stirred into a cup on a cold winter evening in a small smoky hall, to be remembered 1,000 years later as one of the truest small comforts this whole old tradition had to offer. Let your body sink a little further now into stillness, and let us turn to a second gift of the same small striped creature, one that shaped the light itself in every home we have visited tonight. Beeswax, the second great gift of the hive, deserves its own quiet chapter tonight, since it moved through Anglo Saxon life almost as widely as honey itself did, though in rather different and often quieter ways, working, most often, in the background of the household rather than at its center. When honey was harvested from a skep, the wax comb that had held it was set carefully aside rather than discarded, and was rendered down over a gentle fire in a process that took real patience and real attention, since wax scorched easily, and once ruined by too fierce a heat, could not be recovered. Properly rendered, strained through a cloth to remove the last traces of honey and dead bee and pollen, the wax cooled into pale golden blocks that could be stored almost indefinitely until it was needed, remaining stable and useful across seasons, and even across years, in a way that fresh plant material and even prepared salves never quite managed. Its most important medical use lay in binding, holding a preparation of herbs together into a salve that would keep its shape and its consistency across weeks or months of storage, rather than separating or spoiling the way a purely plant and fat-based mixture tended to do on its own. A salve built around a beeswax base, melted gently with animal fat or with plant oil where the household could obtain it, and then worked through with crushed or powdered herbs before being left to cool and set in a small clay pot, could be kept ready on a shelf for a very long time, available the moment a wound or a burn or a chapped, cracked patch of winter skin required it, without any need to prepare a fresh remedy from scratch at the exact moment of need. This mattered enormously in a world where the useful flowering season of many herbs lasted only a few short weeks each year, and where a household needed, therefore, some reliable way of carrying a full year's worth of herbal virtue forward from one brief harvest to the next. Wax, patient and stable, made that carrying possible. Wax salves were used across the surviving remedies for nearly every complaint we have already discussed tonight: wound care, burns, chapped skin, chest complaints rubbed onto the throat and breast, and sore, cracked lips in the depth of a cold English winter, and the particular combination of herb and wax and fat that went into a given pot varied from household to household and healer to healer, each one holding, in effect, a small private formula built up and adjusted across years of use, refined by trial exactly as every other part of this tradition had been. Beyond healing, wax served a second, quite different purpose that touches, in its own way, on the very survival of the knowledge we have been walking through all night. Wax tablets, small wooden frames filled with a thin, smooth layer of beeswax, were used across the early medieval period, in England as elsewhere, as a kind of reusable notebook. Scratched with a sharp stylus and smoothed flat again with the stylus's broader end, whenever the writing was no longer needed, offering a cheap, endlessly reusable surface for exactly the kind of working notes a healer, unable to justify the real expense of prepared parchment for every passing thought, might have kept close at hand, a first, temporary record of a new remedy learned from a traveling healer or a passing monk, tried, adjusted, and only later, if it proved genuinely worth keeping, copied properly onto more lasting parchment, if the household had access to anyone able to make such a copy at all. It is entirely possible, and indeed rather likely, that a good many of the remedies eventually gathered into books like the Lacnunga passed through exactly this kind of humble, waxen, endlessly rewritten first draft before ever reaching the more permanent page. Wax also gave every household its own small, private source of light after the sun went down, in the form of the rushlight, and, for those who could afford the considerably greater expense, the true wax candle. A rushlight was made by soaking the dried pith of the common rush plant in melted fat, tallow rendered from an animal rather than true beeswax in most ordinary households. Since wax itself was valuable enough to be reserved, more often than not, for the church, for the wealthy, and for medicine rather than for everyday illumination. A true beeswax candle burned notably cleaner and brighter than a tallow rushlight, without the heavy smoke and the unpleasant smell that animal fat produced as it burned. And it was for exactly this reason prized above nearly every other form of household light, reserved most often for the altar of the church, for the hall of a lord on an important feast night, and on quieter, more ordinary nights, for exactly the kind of careful, close work, tending a sick patient through a long dark hour, reading a treasured page by its light, that genuinely needed the clean, steady flame that only good wax could provide. There is a real, simple beauty in noticing how completely these two products of a single hive, honey and wax, wove themselves through the whole of this old world, sweetening the bitter draught and closing the open wound, binding 100 separate herbs into a single stable salve and holding, tablet after patient tablet, the first written traces of the very knowledge we have spent tonight walking through together, lighting, at the very last, the small steady flame by which a tired healer might read her own careful notes long after the rest of the household had gone quietly to sleep. Let us gather now, in the last stretch of this long, slow night, a small final handful of the plants themselves, the 9 that any careful Anglo Saxon healer would have known by heart, each one worth a few quiet moments of its own. Let us begin, fittingly, with mugwort, the plant the 9 herbs, charm itself, named first and honored above all the rest, calling it the oldest of worts, the mother of herbs. Mugwort grows tall and grey-green along roadsides and waste ground across the whole of England, its leaves silvery on the underside, its scent sharp and faintly sage, like when the leaf is crushed between the fingers, and beyond its place at the head of the great charm, it carried a long tradition as a traveller's herb, tucked into a shoe or bound about the leg before a journey, on the belief that it eased weariness and protected the walker against exhaustion along the road, a small, practical kindness offered to anyone setting out on foot across the long distances that separated one Anglo Saxon settlement from the next. It was trusted, too, as a woman's herb, used gently in preparations meant to ease the troubles of the monthly cycle, and, tradition holds, to assist in the final stages of childbirth, though such uses, belonging as they did almost entirely to the world of women's knowledge we spoke of earlier, survive for us today only in the barest fragments and hints. Betony, sometimes called bishopwort in the old texts, we have already met once tonight, growing in the Dooryard Garden and guarding, in the old belief, against evil dream and troubled spirit. But it deserves a further, closer look now, since few plants in the whole tradition were praised quite so extravagantly. Beyond the later proverb urging a person to sell his cow rather than go without it, betony appears across the surviving medical texts as a remedy for headache, for troubles of the eye, for wounds, for stomach complaints, and for a very wide range of other, smaller ailments besides. Its reputation resting on the particular, gentle strength of its purple, flowered spike and its soft, slightly rough-textured leaf, gathered, the old instructions specify, in the month of August, when its virtue was held to be at its very fullest. Vervain held a place of particular sanctity across the whole of the ancient and early medieval world, carried west from Roman religious practice, where it had been used in purification rites and treated as a sacred plant offered to the gods, into the Christian centuries that followed, where a gentle new legend attached itself to the plant. Holding that vervain had been found growing at the foot of the cross on the hill of the crucifixion, and had therefore become, from that moment onward, a plant blessed above all others, wept over, the legend says, by tears that gave it a lasting, sacred power. It was gathered with particular ceremony, often at a specific phase of the moon, and always with a spoken blessing, and was used, across the surviving remedies, for wounds, for fevers, and for protection against a very wide range of both physical and spiritual harm. Tucked into amulets and worn close to the body as readily as it was steeped and drunk. Elder, whom we have already met standing watchful at the edge of the dooryard, protected by the presence of its own guardian spirit, and never cut without a spoken word of courtesy first, offered its white blossom for fever, and its dark berry for the chest and throat, and stood across the whole of English folk tradition for many centuries after the Anglo Saxon period had ended, as perhaps the single most respected tree of the entire native landscape, its wood too precious with old belief to burn safely on an ordinary hearth, its flower and fruit too useful to ever be entirely left ungathered. Yarrow, with its feathery, finely divided leaf and its flat-topped cluster of small white flowers, carried a very particular and very practical reputation as a wound herb above almost any other single plant in the whole tradition, sometimes called soldier's woundwort in later English folk speech for exactly this reason, pressed directly against a fresh cut or a battle wound to slow the bleeding, a use that later chemical analysis has shown to rest on genuine ground, since compounds within the plant do measurably assist blood in clotting more quickly than it otherwise would. Its Latin botanical name itself, Achillea, preserves an old story reaching back to the Greek hero Achilles, said to have used the plant to treat his soldiers' wounds upon the field at Troy. A story that had already traveled, by one route or another, all the way from the ancient Mediterranean world into the pages of the Old English herbal tradition, by the time our own manuscripts were copied. Plantain, waybread in the old tongue, we met already standing second among the 9 great herbs of the charm, mother of worts, open to the east, mighty within, and it remains, even now, perhaps the single most common and most overlooked healing plant of the whole English countryside. Its broad ribbed leaf growing thick along every trodden path and worn patch of ground, crushed and applied directly to a sting, a bite, or a small fresh wound, its cooling, slightly astringent sap trusted across many centuries and many different healing traditions to ease pain and encourage a hurt to close cleanly, a genuinely useful plant hiding, then as now, in the very last place a person walking briskly along a busy path would think to look for medicine. Chamomile, called Mathen in Old English and named 5th among the 9 great herbs, brought then, as it still does now, a particular gentleness that set it apart from many of the sharper, more bitter plants around it. Its small daisy-like flower steeped into a mild, apple-scented tea trusted to calm an unsettled stomach, to soothe a fretful child, and to ease the passage into sleep itself, a use that connects this whole ancient tradition directly, across 1,000 years without any real interruption at all, to the very same gentle cup of chamomile tea that a person might still reach for tonight, in a kitchen not so very different in its essential comfort from the low, smoky cottage we have visited so often this evening. Comfrey, met already in the Dooryard Garden as boneset and knitbone, deserves one further quiet mention here for the sheer, patient trust the old healers placed in it, applying its thick, mucilaginous sap directly to breaks and deep wounds on the strength of nothing more than long, careful, repeated observation and finding, though they could never have explained why in any modern chemical terms, that wounds and bones treated with comfrey did indeed seem to close and knit more readily than those left untreated. A small quiet triumph of patient watching over many generations, arriving entirely without any laboratory at all, at a genuinely sound piece of botanical medicine. And wormwood, bitter and grey-leaved, related closely to mugwort and standing, in a sense as its sharper, more astringent cousin, closes our small gathering of 9 tonight, valued above all for its bitterness itself, steeped strongly to expel the intestinal worms that troubled nearly every household in a world without modern sanitation, and used more sparingly, in smaller and more careful doses, as a general tonic for a weak or troubled stomach, a plant whose entire reputation rested on a taste so sharp and so unmistakable that no one, gathering it or preparing it or drinking it down, could ever have doubted for a moment that they were taking real, serious medicine. 9 plants, then, gathered here tonight the way the Anglo Saxon healer herself might have gathered them, one at a time, with care, and with a story attached to each. And though we have left a great many others unmentioned, the cowslip and the wild rose and the humble house leek, and 100 more besides, these 9 offer a fair and honest small window onto the whole wide, patient, deeply observant tradition we have spent this entire quiet night exploring together. Before we come, in these last soft minutes of the night, to the small, particular, everyday troubles that every household eventually faced, let us rest for a while longer on 2 further threads of this old tradition, the illustrated book that named 100 more plants than we have had time for tonight, and the quiet, careful ways an Anglo Saxon household protected itself against harm it could not see. Alongside the Leechbook and the Lacnunga stands a third great manuscript of this tradition, quieter in reputation than the other two but, in its own way, just as remarkable, known today as the Old English Herbarium, where the Leechbook is organized by complaint, moving down the body from head to foot, and the Lacnunga reads like a gathered notebook of remedies and charms. The Herbarium is organized instead by plant, moving through more than 100 entries, each one describing a single herb in turn, its appearance, where it might be found growing, and the particular illnesses it was believed to cure, very often accompanied, in the surviving illustrated copies, by a small careful drawing of the plant itself, rendered in ink, and sometimes in soft washes of color, so that a healer unfamiliar with a given plant's appearance might have some real hope of recognizing it correctly when she found it growing wild. The Herbarium was not, in its origins, an English work at all, but a translation made with real care sometime before the year 1000, of a much older Latin text traditionally attributed to a writer known as Pseudo-Apuleius, itself drawing on an even older tradition of Mediterranean plant lore reaching back, through many intermediate copies and translations, toward the classical botanical writing of the ancient world. This journey, from Greek and Roman plant knowledge, through Latin compilation, into a careful English translation made by an Anglo Saxon scholar working perhaps in a monastery scriptorium on a cold English morning, illustrates something we have touched on more than once tonight. The way this whole tradition sat at the meeting point of many different inherited streams of knowledge, local observation blending steadily with a much older, much wider Mediterranean inheritance, carried north across centuries and across seas until it settled, translated now into the healer's own English tongue, onto the shelf of an ordinary English monastery, bound together with the Herbarium in several of its surviving manuscript copies, is a shorter, stranger companion text known as the Medicina de Quadrupedibus, meaning simply the medicine of four-footed animals, which turns its attention away from plants entirely and toward remedies drawn instead from animals, their fat, their bile, their various organs, and even, in a handful of entries, from smaller creatures like the mouse, prescribed and prepared for a range of complaints in exactly the same careful, descriptive style the Herbarium used for its plants. Read together, the two texts remind us that Anglo-Saxon medicine drew on the whole of the natural world available to it, plant and animal alike, and that the careful, systematic, plant-by-plant cataloguing style of the Herbarium, moving steadily through its long list of remedies, sits very close in feeling to the same gentle, patient, list-based procession we ourselves have been walking through this entire quiet night. One further body of knowledge deserves a few quiet minutes here as well, since it touches so many of the threads we have already gathered together. The careful Anglo-Saxon reckoning of days and of the moon in relation to the practice of medicine, and in particular to the practice of bloodletting, a treatment that, across the whole of medieval Europe, was considered one of the most important tools any healer possessed. Bloodletting rested on the same humoral theory that shaped so much of the Leechbook's more formal, Latin-derived medical content, the belief that health depended on a proper balance among the body's four humours, and that an excess of blood, understood as one of these four vital fluids, could itself become a cause of illness, relieved by opening a vein, most often at the arm, and allowing a measured quantity of blood to be drawn off under careful supervision. Anglo Saxon medical calendars, several of which survive bound alongside the larger medical texts, took real care to specify which days of the month and which phases of the moon were considered favorable or unfavorable for this and other treatments, listing certain days, sometimes called Egyptian days in a tradition borrowed from continental sources, as particularly dangerous, on which no bloodletting, and indeed very little medical treatment of any serious kind, should be attempted at all. The moon itself was watched with real, sustained attention for this purpose, its waxing and waning tracked not only for the gathering of herbs, as we heard earlier tonight, but for the timing of bloodletting as well, with the days immediately following the full moon widely favored as the safest and most effective time for the treatment, on the belief that the body's own fluids rose and fell in some sympathy with the moon's own visible cycle overhead, echoing, in the body, the very same tides that the moon was already known to govern in the sea. This careful watching of sky and calendar alongside plant and patient tells us something important about how thoroughly integrated this whole system of belief really was. Nothing in Anglo-Saxon medicine happened in isolation. The healer-gathering Beatany in August was working from the same underlying sense of ordered, rhythmic time as the healer choosing a day after the full moon to open a vein, both trusting that the world moved according to real, knowable patterns, the season, the moon, the turning of the year, and that a wise healer worked with those patterns rather than against them, waiting where waiting was called for, exactly as patiently as we ourselves are waiting now, here in the quiet dark, for sleep to finally arrive. Let us turn now gently to the quieter, more private forms of protection an Anglo-Saxon household kept close at hand, worn rather than spoken, carried rather than sung. Not every form of protection in this old tradition needed to be spoken aloud at all. A great deal of Anglo-Saxon defense against illness and misfortune was carried quietly on the body itself, worn, sewn, or hung close, trusted to work simply through steady, patient nearness rather than through any single dramatic act of speech. Take small stones, particularly those with a natural hole worn through them by running water, were gathered from riverbeds and from the shoreline and kept as protective charms, hung on a cord about the neck or tied into clothing, valued especially in later folklore that very likely reaches back into this earlier period, for protection against nightmare and against the kind of heavy, breathless, frightening night pressure that later English tradition would come to call being hag-ridden. Amber, washed up along stretches of the English and continental coastline, and traded inland along routes that had carried it since long before the Anglo-Saxon period even began, was prized as a protective and healing substance in its own right, warm to the touch, faintly fragrant when rubbed, and associated across a very wide span of ancient and early medieval cultures with the sun and with a kind of stored, captured warmth that made it especially valued as an amulet against cold-related illness. We have already met the old flint arrowheads that gathered, in later folklore, the name elf bolts, kept and carried specifically, because they were believed to be the very darts that caused elf shot in the first place. Worn as a kind of protective trophy, the supposed weapon of harm turned through careful handling, into a shield against further harm. Iron itself, in a wide range of forms, a small knife, a nail, a simple ring, was trusted across this period and for many centuries afterward as a substance that unseen and unfriendly beings found difficult to approach, and a blade laid quietly beneath a bed, or a nail driven into a threshold, appears repeatedly across the wider folklore of early medieval Britain as a small, practical, physical defense against exactly the kind of nighttime trouble the elf charms addressed in words. Numbers themselves carried real protective weight throughout this tradition, and two in particular recur again and again across the surviving charms with a frequency too consistent to be accidental. 3 and its multiple 9 appear constantly in the 3 glory twigs that struck the serpent in the origin story of the 9 herbs charm, in charms sung 3 times over a wound, in the 7 times 3 days, sometimes specified for a treatment to run its full course, and in the 9 herbs of that same great charm, 9 standing. Across this tradition, and across a great many others besides, as a number of particular completeness and particular power, perhaps because it is 3 multiplied by itself, a doubling of an already significant number into something felt to be still stronger again. A charm repeated the correct number of times, in the correct pattern, direction, and rhythm, was trusted to carry more weight than the very same words spoken only once, carelessly, without proper attention to their number. Small bags or pouches, sewn from scraps of linen and filled with a particular combination of herb, stone, or written charm, were worn against the chest or hung above a bed, a practice that, again, would continue in various forms across English folk custom for many centuries after the Anglo Saxon period had formally ended, gradually shading, in later medieval centuries, into the practice of carrying a written charm, a specific verse or prayer, inscribed on a small scrap of parchment folded tightly and worn exactly as the herb-filled pouch had once been worn. The written word itself now trusted to carry the same protective weight that spoken sound and gathered plant had always carried before it. What runs through all of these small worn and carried protections, the hold stone, the warm amber, the cold iron, the careful count of 3 and of 9, is the same underlying instinct we have met again and again this whole quiet night, the sense that the world was full of unseen influence, some kind, some unkind, and that a thoughtful person did not simply wait passively to discover which kind had found them, but took quiet, patient, ordinary steps. A stone gathered from a particular river, a charm repeated a particular number of times to tilt the balance gently and steadily toward safety. None of it was frantic. None of it was born from panic. It was instead simply part of the same careful, attentive, deeply patient way of living alongside an uncertain world that produced every other remedy we have gathered together tonight. One more quiet, ordinary form of hope, carried close and trusted. Let us come, now, in these final gentle stretches of the night, to the small, human troubles that touched nearly every household in this old world, the aching tooth, the rising fever, and the long, difficult hours of a birth. Before we come to the remedies themselves, it is worth pausing for a moment on how seriously this old society took the plain fact of bodily injury, since the surviving Anglo Saxon law codes, quite apart from the medical manuscripts we have spent the night among, preserve a remarkably detailed and, in its own strange way, oddly comforting record of exactly this concern. the earliest of these codes, set down in the Kingdom of Kent under a king named Aethelbert at the very start of the 7th century, includes long and careful lists of compensation owed for almost every conceivable injury a person might suffer at another's hand, a fixed payment for the loss of an ear, a different payment again for the loss of a thumbnail, a separate figure for each individual finger, graded carefully according to which finger it was, and how much use of the hand its loss would take away, and separate figures again for a knocked-out tooth, with the front teeth, more visible and more sorely missed, valued at a notably higher compensation than a molar further back in the jaw. Later law codes, issued by later kings across the following centuries, refined and expanded this same careful, itemized approach, addressing wounds to the head according to how deep they ran, whether they merely broke the skin, or reached the bone beneath, or pierced all the way through to the brain itself, each depth carrying its own separate, specified payment. There is something quietly moving in the sheer patience of this legal tradition. The same patience we have met all night in the careful gathering of a single herb, or the careful wording of a single charm, now turned toward the equally careful business of making a wronged or injured person whole again, not through vengeance, which the law codes worked hard to discourage and to replace, but through a fixed, agreed, entirely calculable payment, a society doing its considerable best to answer the plain, unavoidable fact of bodily harm with order, with fairness, and with the kind of careful, itemized attention that, in its own way, mirrors the same careful attention a healer gave to a wound she was actually trying to close. Alongside this careful legal reckoning of harm done by one person to another ran a real, working knowledge of harm the natural world itself could cause, and Anglo Saxon healers held a clear, practical understanding that certain plants, handled or taken carelessly, could sicken or even kill rather than heal. Hemlock, tall and pale-stemmed, its leaves finely divided and easily mistaken, to an inexperienced eye, for the harmless wild carrot or parsley it closely resembles, was known and feared as a genuine poison, and the surviving texts are careful, where they mention it at all, to note its danger rather than to recommend its use. Henbane, with its sickly pale yellow flower veined in purple and its heavy, unpleasant scent, was recognized as capable of producing a deep, dangerous stupor if taken in too great a quantity, and was handled, where it was used at all, medicinally for pain and for sleep, only in the most careful and measured doses, prepared by someone who genuinely understood the fine, narrow line in this particular plant between a helpful dose and a harmful one. Deadly nightshade, its dark, glossy berries sweet enough to tempt a careless child, was known and avoided by anyone with real experience of the countryside. Its danger passed down as a matter of plain practical caution rather than formal medical teaching. The kind of warning a mother gave a small child walking with her along a hedgerow long before the child could read a single word of any manuscript at all. Where poisoning was genuinely suspected, whether from a plant eaten by mistake or, more rarely, feared as a deliberate act, the old remedies reached, as remedies had reached across the whole ancient and medieval world, for a mixture of practical and symbolic treatment together, inducing vomiting where this seemed wise, offering milk or fat-rich foods believed to blunt the action of a poison within the stomach, and very often adding a spoken charm or a prayer alongside the physical treatment, addressing the poison directly, exactly as the elf-shot charm had addressed the invisible spear, commanding it to lose its power and depart. This same careful respect for the real, physical danger certain plants could pose sits comfortably alongside everything else. We have learned tonight about how closely this tradition watched the natural world, trusting it deeply for its gifts, while never once forgetting, or letting a household forget, that the very same hedgerow that offered comfrey for a broken bone and betony for a troubled head could offer harm as readily as help to anyone careless enough not to know the difference. Let us turn now, gently, to a handful of the small, ordinary complaints that touched nearly every household in this old world, sooner or later, and to the quiet remedies that met each one in turn. Toothache was met across nearly the whole of the medieval world, and not only in England, with a shared and very persistent belief that the pain was caused by a small worm burrowing within the tooth itself, gnawing at it from the inside, an idea that appears, in one form or another, across a great many ancient and medieval medical traditions, and which offered, whatever its scientific accuracy, at least a clear and graspable explanation for a pain that otherwise seemed to arrive from nowhere at all. Remedies aimed at this supposed worm ranged from the herbal, henbane seed burned, and its smoke directed carefully into the aching tooth, on the belief that the worm would be driven out or killed by the fumes, to the purely charm-based, short-spoken formulas addressed directly to the worm itself, commanding it to leave the tooth in peace. Alongside these more elaborate treatments sat simpler, more practical measures that any household might try on its own. Clove, when it could be obtained through trade from far beyond England's own shores, pressed directly against the aching tooth for its numbing, faintly warming effect, and salt water, rinsed warm around the mouth, trusted then exactly as it still is now to ease a swollen or infected gum. Headache met a correspondingly wide range of responses, from the purely herbal, betony above nearly every other plant, as we heard earlier, gathered in August and steeped for exactly this purpose, to remedies that combined plant and charm together in the pattern we have met so many times tonight. A paste of crushed herbs bound to the forehead or the temples while a short verse was spoken over the patient. A cooling compress, a cloth soaked in cold water or in a mild vinegar solution and laid across the brow offered the same simple, sensible comfort it offers a person with a headache today and rest in a quiet, dim corner of the hall, away from noise and from bright firelight, was recommended then exactly as sensibly as it would be recommended by any physician now, a reminder that not every old remedy needed charm or ceremony at all, since some kinds of comfort have simply never needed improving upon. Fever, and in particular the recurring cyclical fever that English speakers would later come to call the ague, common across the low, wet, marshy fen country of eastern England, where mosquitoes bred freely in the standing water of the drained and undrained land alike, was met with a particularly rich body of remedy and charm together. Willow bark, boiled into a bitter tea, was trusted to ease fever and the aching, feverish pain that so often accompanied it, a trust that rested, we now know, on genuinely sound ground, since willow bark contains a natural compound closely related to the active ingredient in modern aspirin, another quiet, small example of old, patient observation arriving by its own long road. at real and useful medicine centuries before any chemist could have explained precisely why it worked. Alongside willow bark, a very particular and rather startling charm survives from later medieval English folk tradition, likely reaching back in some form into this earlier period, involving a live spider, sealed carefully into a small nutshell or a scrap of cloth and worn about the neck, on the belief that the fever would pass, gradually and mysteriously, from the patient into the spider as the small creature slowly weakened and died within its little shell, carrying the sickness away with it as it went. Strange as it sounds to a modern ear, the underlying logic is of a piece with everything else we have heard tonight. Sickness understood as a real, almost physical thing that could, given the correct ritual, be persuaded to leave one body and enter another, smaller, more expendable one instead. For a troubled stomach, mint and fennel and dill, all three familiar to us now from the Dooryard Garden, were steeped and offered warm, gentle remedies for a complaint that, then as now, responded well to simple, mild, warming treatment rather than to anything more dramatic. For trouble of the eye, beyond the famous garlic and wine salve of the Leechbook we met earlier tonight, a wash of rose water or of a mild honey and water solution was used to soothe irritation and clean the eye of ordinary dust and grime, honey's own mild antibacterial property offering, once again, a real and measurable benefit that the old healer trusted through long observation rather than through any understanding of bacteria at all. And for the ordinary, everyday complaints of the skin, a scrape, a rash, a patch of dry and cracking winter skin, comfrey and house leak, and the rendered fat we met beside the hearth did steady, unglamorous, genuinely useful work, exactly the kind of quiet, patient medicine that never needed a manuscript at all to be trusted, because it had already proven itself, gently and repeatedly, across 100 ordinary winters. The long hours of childbirth touched every household eventually and belonged, as we noted earlier tonight, almost entirely to the world of women's knowledge, passed from mother to daughter and from experienced neighbor to first-time mother, across an unbroken chain of memory that has left us, sadly, only scattered fragments in the written record, since the men who held the pens in this period rarely thought to record what they themselves had little direct part in. What fragments do survive suggest a practice built, as so much of this tradition was, from a careful blend of practical comfort and spoken charm together. Certain herbs, mugwort among them, as we heard when we gathered our 9 plants earlier tonight, were trusted to ease and to hasten along labor, prepared as a warm drink offered to the laboring woman by the older women gathered around her. Women who had themselves, in most cases, already been through the very same long hours more than once, and who brought to the room not only their herbal knowledge, but the simple, steady, practical comfort of genuine experience. A woman's girdle, sometimes a specially blessed or specially inscribed one, kept for exactly this purpose and lent from household to household across a whole village, was tied about the laboring woman in the belief that it eased and shortened her labor. And in later medieval centuries, once written charms had become more widely available. Actual scraps of parchment inscribed with protective verses were sometimes wrapped or bound directly against the laboring woman's body for the very same purpose. A direct continuation of the older herb-filled amulet pouch we met earlier tonight. Its contents changed from plant to written word, but its underlying logic. Protection worn close against the body through the most dangerous hours a woman in this period was likely ever to face, entirely unchanged. Once a child was safely born, a further body of small, careful custom surrounded its earliest days. Honey, warmed and offered in the smallest possible quantity, was sometimes given to a newborn as an early, gentle nourishment, and in the belief of the time, as a small protective blessing besides, and swaddling, the practice of wrapping an infant snugly in soft cloth, was trusted, as it is again by a good many parents today, to offer a small newborn a comforting echo of the closeness and containment of the womb it had so recently left. Herbs believed to protect and to soothe come a mile above nearly all the others for exactly the gentleness we heard about earlier tonight, were kept close to a cradle. And a small protective charm was very often spoken quietly over a newborn in its first days, asking in whatever words the household's own tradition supplied, for health, for growth, and for a long and steady life ahead, the very same hopeful impulse that opened this entire tradition all those centuries ago, now turned toward the smallest and newest member of the household, the one who would, in time, carry all of this same knowledge forward in turn, if the household was fortunate to children and grandchildren of her own. It is a fitting thought to rest on here, as our long walk through this old tradition begins, at last, to draw toward its close, this image of knowledge passed forward, generation after patient generation, mother to daughter, healer to apprentice, monk to novice, copying out a manuscript page by careful page, each one adding, here and there, some small refinement of their own, before passing the whole accumulated inheritance onward again. Nothing we have heard tonight, the great manuscripts, the charms, the gardens, the honey and the wax, the small worn stones and the careful, itemized law codes sprang into being all at once. All of it grew slowly across centuries, out of exactly the same patient, careful, hopeful human effort that every single remedy in this old tradition was ultimately built from the simple, enduring wish to ease another person's suffering and to leave behind, for whoever came next, a little more knowledge of how that might be done. There is one further thread of this old tradition that belongs, more than any other we have gathered tonight, to exactly this quiet hour, and it is worth resting on for a while before we finally let the lamp burn down, the remedies this old world kept against a restless night and a sleep that would not come. Poppy was known in England from a very early period, brought originally, like so much else in this tradition, along old trade routes reaching back toward the Mediterranean world, and its seed head, scored and left to weep its thick, milky sap, was recognized clearly as a preparation of real strength, capable of easing pain and of bringing on a deep, heavy sleep, and handled, in every surviving reference to it, with real and careful caution, measured out sparingly, rather than offered freely, understood, in the same careful way hemlock and henbane were understood, as a substance whose helpfulness and whose danger sat very close together, separated only by the healer's own careful measure. Lettuce too, particularly the milky sap that rises from a cut lettuce stem, was trusted, in a gentler and altogether safer way than poppy, as a mild aid to sleep, steeped or simply eaten before bed, its soft, faintly bitter juice believed, correctly as later chemistry would confirm in its own small way, to carry a genuinely mild sedative property. Valerian root, with its strong, distinctive, not altogether pleasant smell, was dug and dried and steeped into a tea for exactly the same purpose. Trusted then almost exactly as certain gentle sleep preparations are still trusted now, its effectiveness resting on the same careful centuries of patient household observation that had already proven so much of the rest of this tradition sound. Chamomile, met so often already tonight, closes this small gathering of sleep herbs as gently as it closes so many long days even now, steeped into its own soft, apple-scented tea and offered warm, in the last hour before the household settled for the night, and warm milk itself, sometimes sweetened with a little honey, was offered for exactly the same purpose, valued for its simple, physical warmth as much as for any particular property of the milk itself, a small, ordinary comfort that a tired body has trusted, in one form or another, across a great many centuries and a great many different cultures far beyond England alone. Beyond the purely herbal, the approach of night carried its own careful ritual in most Anglo Saxon households, closely bound up with the rhythm of the Church's own daily prayer. The monastic day was divided into a series of fixed hours of prayer, the last of them said just before the community retired for the night, known as compline, a word that comes from the Latin for completion, and in households far beyond the monastery walls a quieter, less formal echo of this same practice took hold, a short prayer said, or a blessing quietly murmured, before the household finally settled onto its sleeping benches, and the fire was banked down for the night, asking, in whatever words a given family kept, for a safe and untroubled sleep and a safe waking in the morning to follow it. This last request for a safe and untroubled night was not, in this tradition, a merely formal or empty one, since the hours of sleep themselves were widely believed to carry their own particular vulnerability. We have already met, earlier tonight, the belief that elves and other unseen influences moved most freely in the deep, silent hours after the fire had burned low, and closely related to this was a further, specific belief in a kind of night spirit or presence, remembered in later English folk tradition under the name of the mare, understood as a being that might settle upon a sleeper's chest during the night, pressing down with a heavy, suffocating weight, and bringing with it dark, frightening, and confused dreaming. It is this old belief, astonishingly, that survives directly in our own modern English language, entirely unnoticed by most of us who use it every day, in the very word nightmare itself, a mare of the night, a linguistic fossil carrying, folded quietly inside one perfectly ordinary modern word. The whole of this old Anglo-Saxon fear across more than 1,000 years, without a single break in the chain. Against this particular danger, the same small protections we met earlier tonight were pressed into service once again. A blade laid quietly beneath the pillow, a particular herb hung close above the bed, a charm or a simple prayer spoken before the eyes finally closed, and beyond these specific defenses, the whole quiet, patient character of this entire tradition offered, in itself, a kind of protection, since a mind that has spent its evening in careful, ordinary, attentive activity, tending a garden, preparing a remedy, listening to a familiar charm spoken in a familiar voice, settles toward sleep very differently than a mind left alone with nothing at all to hold on to in the dark. The whole slow, patient, careful world we have walked through together tonight, the gardens and the manuscripts and the honey and the charms, was not only medicine for the body, It was, in its own quiet way, medicine for exactly the kind of restless, wakeful mind that still, all these centuries later, keeps so many of us lying awake, waiting, as you are waiting now, for sleep to finally, gently arrive. Let your breathing settle a little further still, and let us walk out, one last time tonight, beyond the cottage door, and look up briefly at the wide sky and the turning seasons that shaped so much of how this old tradition understood health in the first place. Anglo Saxon households paid very close attention to the weather and to the season, not out of idle curiosity, but because both were understood as direct and immediate influences on the body's own health, in a way that sits very close, in fact, to how a modern person still instinctively feels a change coming on, with a shift in the weather, an ache in an old joint before the rain arrives, a heaviness in the air before a storm breaks. Damp was regarded with particular and consistent caution throughout the surviving medical texts, understood as a condition that could settle into the body itself, into the joints and the chest especially, bringing with it the aches and the coughs and the low, persistent fevers that a wet English autumn or a long grey winter reliably produced, and a great deal of ordinary household practice, keeping dry, changing wet clothing promptly, sitting close to the fire after a day spent working out of doors in the rain, was recommended and followed for exactly this reason. Plain good sense dressed where it needed to be, in the language of humoral balance. The turning of the seasons themselves carried real weight in how remedies were timed and understood. Spring, when the first fresh growth pushed up through the winter's cold, was widely regarded as a season for cleansing and for gentle strengthening, a time to take fresh bitter greens, nettle chief among them, into the diet after a long winter spent on stored and salted food, a practice that has left a real trace in later English folk custom. The springtime nettle soup or nettle pudding, still occasionally made in parts of rural England today, direct descendant of exactly this old seasonal habit of clearing the winter's heaviness from the body with the very first fresh green thing the year had to offer. Summer, warm and dry, was the season of harvest for the great majority of the year's medicinal herbs, gathered at what was believed to be the peak of their strength, and dried carefully for the months ahead. Autumn brought its own particular remedies. Honey harvested from the hive at exactly this time of year, roots like comfrey and bitoni dug once their leaves had died back, and their strength, as we heard earlier tonight, was believed to have drawn down fully into the root itself. And winter, cold, dark and long, was above all the season of the stored remedy. The dried herb taken down from the rafter, the wax-sealed salve opened from its jar, the whole household drawing, through the hardest months of the year, on exactly the careful, patient work of gathering and preparing that every earlier season had made possible. Certain natural signs were watched too, for what they might suggest about the character of the coming season, and by extension, about the illnesses that season was likely to bring with it. A particularly heavy crop of berries on the hawthorn or the elder in autumn was read, in later English folk tradition, very likely reaching back into this earlier period, as a sign of a hard winter still to come, and households adjusted their preparations accordingly, gathering and storing a little more generously than usual against the harder months, such a sign seemed to promise. The behavior of birds and of livestock was watched in a similar spirit, animals sensing, or seeming to sense, changes in the weather before any human observer could. And a careful household paid quiet attention to these small signs, the same way it paid attention to the moon's phase or the calendar's marked days, one more thread in the same wide, patient web of observation that this whole tradition was woven from. What comes through clearly, gathering all of this together in these last few minutes, is that health, in this old world, was never understood as something separate from the wider turning of the natural world around it. The body's own rhythms, its fevers rising and falling, its aches shifting with the damp, its strength waxing through the spring and settling, at last, into winter's long stillness, were felt to move in close company with the rhythms of sun and moon and season overhead. And a great deal of the wisdom of this tradition lay simply in learning to move with those rhythms rather than fighting against them, resting when the season called for rest, gathering when the season called for gathering, and trusting through the darkest, coldest stretch of every single year that spring and strength and light would eventually return, exactly as they always, patiently had. Let us turn now to a smaller, quieter, more practical matter, one that touches nearly every remedy we have gathered tonight without our ever quite pausing to name it directly, the question of how much. An Anglo Saxon healer, working almost entirely without any of the standardized measuring tools a modern kitchen or a modern pharmacy would take completely for granted, relied instead on a set of careful, everyday equivalents built from whatever ordinary household objects came most readily to hand. A quantity of a dried herb might be measured by the eggshell full, a genuinely practical unit given how common eggs were in nearly every household, and a liquid might be measured by the spoon, though the spoon itself, carved from wood or occasionally cast in a little bronze, varied enough from household to household that a careful healer learned, over years of practice, to trust her own particular spoon and her own particular hand rather than any fixed external standard at all. Larger quantities were measured against the household's own vessels, a cup, a small bowl, a particular jar kept for exactly this purpose and no other, and the healer's whole skill rested, in no small part, on the steady, practiced consistency of her own hand, repeating, treatment after treatment, and year after year, the very same careful measure that long experience had shown to be safe and effective. Exactly the kind of hard-won, embodied knowledge that no written recipe, however carefully copied, could ever fully replace. Numbers themselves, as we heard earlier when we spoke of amulets, carried weight well beyond simple measurement, and a great many remedies specify not only how much of an ingredient to use, but how many times a process should be repeated, 3 stirs of the mixture, 9 days of standing before it was ready, 7 applications of a poultice before the treatment was considered complete, the correct number felt across this whole tradition to matter every bit as much as the correct quantity. A remedy prepared with the wrong count of stirs, or the wrong number of waiting days considered, by the careful healer, not quite properly made at all, however correct its ingredients might otherwise have been. Beyond the healer working alone within her own household or her own small village, a further figure moved through this old landscape, the traveling healer, passing from settlement to settlement along the same rough tracks and drovers' roads that carried traders and peddlers and the occasional wandering scholar or churchman between one small English community and the next. Such a healer carried her knowledge and her materials with her in a pack or a set of saddlebags, dried herbs wrapped carefully in cloth to keep the damp away, a small store of prepared salves in clay pots sealed with wax, and very often a modest collection of the more valuable, harder to obtain ingredients that reached England only through trade, ready to be offered for a fee in coin or, just as often, in food and lodging for the night, to any household along her route with a need great enough to justify calling on a stranger's particular skill, rather than relying on the knowledge already held within the family itself. The arrival of such a traveller was, in a small, quiet way, a genuine event in the life of an isolated rural household, an opportunity not only to seek treatment for whatever trouble had prompted the visit, but to exchange knowledge as well, a local remedy shared in return for a new one learned, a fresh piece of news carried from a distant village or a distant market town. The whole slow, patient spread of medical knowledge across Anglo Saxon England depending, in no small part, on exactly these kinds of quiet, ordinary, foot-borne exchanges, one healer's careful observation gradually becoming, through years of just such casual sharing, the common inheritance of a much wider community than she alone could ever have reached on her own. Let us rest for a few final minutes on where some of this wider inheritance actually came from, since a surprising amount of what filled an Anglo-Saxon healer's store had travelled a very great distance indeed before it ever reached her hands. England, for all that this whole tradition feels, so often, like a story of purely local knowledge, a purely local hedgerow, and a purely local garden, was never in fact cut off from the much wider medical world of the early medieval period, and a genuinely remarkable range of imported material found its way, across many hands and many miles, into the ordinary Anglo-Saxon apothecary's store. Pepper, carried originally from far beyond, even the Mediterranean world, along trade routes that stretched, in their full length, all the way to distant lands most Anglo-Saxon households could barely have imagined, appears repeatedly across the surviving medical texts, valued and clearly expensive, reserved for the more serious remedies rather than for everyday household use. Ginger and pepper both making their way north, through a long chain of Mediterranean and continental merchants before ever reaching an English port, appears in the same select company, a warming spice trusted for the stomach, and, where a household could afford it, added to warm possets and cordials for exactly the strengthening, fortifying effect we heard about earlier tonight beside the hearth. Frankincense and myrrh, the same fragrant resins remembered from the Christmas story told in every English church, arrived through trade routes closely bound up with the church's own wide, international network of contact and exchange, and were used within England, both in religious ceremony and in medicine, burned for their sweet, cleansing smoke and used, ground and mixed in a range of salves and preparations for wounds and for skin complaints. Wine, imported chiefly from the vineyards of continental Europe, since England's own cooler climate never supported large-scale winemaking of its own in this period, served as more than a drink of celebration, used constantly throughout the medical texts as a base in which to steep and dissolve herbs, its own mild preservative and antiseptic properties, entirely unknown in any scientific sense to the healers who relied on it, nonetheless working steadily and reliably in their favor every single time a herb was left to infuse within it. Silk, though it belongs more properly to trade and to fine clothing than to medicine directly, traveled the very same long routes and passed through many of the very same hands as these medical imports. A small reminder of just how far a single thread of trade could reach, from the silk-producing regions of the distant East, through countless intermediate merchants and markets, all the way to a wealthy English household, or a well-endowed English monastery. Monasteries, in particular, sat at the very center of this wider network of exchange, since their international connections to other religious houses across the continent, maintained through letters, through traveling clergy, and through the shared, cross-border structure of the wider church, gave them access to goods and to knowledge that an ordinary village household could rarely reach directly on its own. A monastery's physic garden might grow not only the native English herbs we walked through earlier tonight, but a handful of genuinely foreign plants as well, cultivated with real care and real effort in a climate never quite suited to them, valued highly enough to justify that extra trouble precisely because the Latin medical texts the monks were busy translating called for them by name, and a monastery's own stores might include, alongside dried mugwort and batony gathered from the local hedgerow, small precious quantities of imported pepper or frankincense, purchased or received as a gift, kept carefully for the most serious cases that came to the infirmary door. This wider web of trade and exchange reminds us, gently, that the quiet cottage healer we began this whole night beside, gathering her 9 herbs by dawn light at the edge of a Norfolk or a Yorkshire fen, was never quite as isolated as she might, at first, have seemed. Threads reached out from her small, smoky hearth in every direction, north to the wax and honey of her own hive, south along the trade roads toward the wine and the pepper of a much warmer world, back through borrowed Latin translation toward the ancient physicians of Greece and Rome, and forward, across the many centuries between her own time and ours, toward a modern laboratory that would one day test her garlic and her onion and her wine and find, to its genuine astonishment, that she had known something true all along. Before we leave the fields and roads of this old world entirely, let us rest a while longer on one further charm, gentler in its purpose than any we have met so far tonight, since it was addressed not to a sick body at all, but to the tired, overworked earth itself. This charm survives under the modern name Salve, meaning simply a remedy for the field, or a field blessing, and it is, in its way, one of the loveliest and most unhurried pieces of the entire Old English charm tradition. A long, patient ritual meant to restore fertility to land that had grown poor or bewitched or simply tired from long use. And it unfolds across a whole night, and the following morning with exactly the same slow, careful, ceremonial pacing that every remedy we have met tonight has shared. It begins in darkness, well before dawn, with 4 sods or turves, cut from the 4 corners of the troubled field, and these are carried, the charm instructs, to a church where oil, honey, yeast, milk from every animal grazing the land, and a portion of every kind of tree growing upon it, along with a portion of every named herb the household could gather, are worked together and poured over the sods, and where a priest is asked to say 4 masses over them, 1 for each of the 4 turves, before they are carried back as the sun begins to rise. to the very same four corners of the field from which they were first cut and set back into the earth exactly as they had been taken from it. Once the sods are returned to their places, the charm turns to the seed itself, addressed directly, exactly as the elf-shot charm addressed the invisible spear, and the wen charm addressed the stubborn swelling, calling upon the earth as a mother of all growing things, asking her by name for a full harvest, bright fields of barley and wheat, white fields of wheat, and broad crops of every other grain besides. And this same address to the earth as mother, gathered here in a charm for the health of the land itself, is built from precisely the same old reverence we heard much earlier tonight in the small spoken thanks a healer offered before pulling a single root from the soil, the whole tradition, in the end, resting on one single underlying conviction, that the earth itself was a living, generous presence, owed courtesy and gratitude in exchange for everything it gave, whether that gift was a single healing herb gathered for one sick patient, or a whole season's bread for an entire village. The plough itself was blessed in turn, sprinkled with holy water and with incense, and the first furrow was cut only after a further short prayer had been spoken over the ground, asking for protection against blight, against sudden frost, against the older, half-remembered fear of witchcraft laid upon the land by an unfriendly hand, a fear addressed in one striking line of the charm, with the same plain, direct confidence the elf-shot charm had shown toward its invisible spear, naming the harm and commanding it, firmly and without any panic at all, to depart. There is something very fitting in pausing on a charm addressed not to a single suffering body, but to the whole wide, tired, patient earth beneath every single body this entire tradition ever tended. A reminder that health, in this old English way of thinking, was never only a private matter between one healer and one patient, but something that reached outward as well to the field and the harvest and the whole shared communal fortune of a village that would rise or fall together, one long season at a time, exactly as surely as any single fevered patient rose or fell within the walls of a single small cottage. One further quiet tradition belongs here as well, close beside the sleep herbs and the night charms we gathered earlier, since the Anglo Saxons did not only try to protect the sleeper from a troubled night, they also paid real, careful attention to what the sleeper's own dreams might mean once morning came. Dream interpretation was a genuine and fairly widespread interest across the early medieval English world, and at least one substantial guide to it, translated from an older continental source, often known by the Latin name Somnile Danielis, or the Dream Book of Daniel, circulated in English translation, offering, in the same patient, itemized style the law codes used for injury, and the herbarium used for plants, a long list of specific dream images, each one paired with what it was believed to foretell about the dreamer's coming health, fortune, or trouble. To dream of clear, flowing water was widely read as a favorable sign, promising health and ease to come, while troubled or muddy water suggested illness or difficulty on its way. To dream of certain birds, of teeth falling out, of climbing to a high place or falling from one. Each carried its own particular, catalogued meaning, consulted the following morning with the same careful, unhurried attention a household gave to reading the weather or the phase of the moon. This habit of reading the dream as a genuine source of information about the body's coming health sits very comfortably beside everything else we have gathered tonight, one more thread in the same wide, patient web of observation and careful record keeping that shaped this entire tradition, the conviction running through charm and herb and dream alike, that the world offered up its own quiet signs to anyone patient enough to notice them, and that a household's task was simply to watch closely and to remember and to pass what it had noticed carefully onward to whoever came next. The plants and remedies we have spent tonight walking through also found their way, now and again, into pure poetry, quite apart from any medical or practical purpose at all, and one particular collection deserves a quiet mention before we close, a great manuscript known today as the Exeter Book, kept safe for many centuries within the library of Exeter Cathedral, and treasured above all for the long, playful sequence of riddles it preserves, short verses that describe some perfectly ordinary object or creature in disguised, puzzling language, inviting the listener to guess what is truly being described. Several of these riddles turn their attention to exactly the substances we have spent this whole night among. One describes a small, humble, hard-working creature, wild-born yet gentle, that gathers its food across the wide fields and carries it home to a dwelling it has built with a curious, careful art, and ends by asking, almost teasingly, what its own sweet, golden produce should rightly be called, a gentle riddling portrait of the bee, and its honeycomb that any listener familiar with a working hive, as nearly every Anglo Saxon household was, would have recognized within a line or two, delighted by the small, patient game of naming something so entirely familiar through language deliberately turned strange and roundabout. Another well-loved riddle describes a substance born of a small creature's labor that becomes, once gathered and properly transformed by human hands, something that can bind a person fast, loosen the tongue, and steal away sense and strength alike if taken too freely, a riddling, indirect description of mead itself, brewed as we heard earlier from exactly the honey gathered in the very same golden comb the previous riddle had already described, the whole small sequence forming a kind of playful, poetic companion piece to the plainer, more practical honey and mead and hive lore we gathered earlier tonight. It is a lovely thing to hold on to in these final quiet minutes, that the same substances trusted to close a wound or sweeten a bitter draught were also trusted by exactly the same culture to furnish a good riddle for a long winter evening beside the very same fire where so many of tonight's other remedies were made, medicine and poetry and simple fireside entertainment all drawn, once again, from precisely the same small, patient, well-loved hive. Let us turn, for these last few minutes before the true wind down begins, to the coast itself, since England has never, in any century, been very far from the sea, and the sea offered this old tradition a small further store of remedy quite distinct from anything the Dooryard Garden or the hedgerow could provide. Salt, gathered by evaporating seawater in shallow pans along stretches of the English and eastern coastline, or won more laboriously from inland brine springs where the coast lay too distant to reach easily, was valued as both preservative and medicine together, dissolved in warm water for exactly the mouth and gum complaints we heard about earlier tonight, and rubbed, in a stronger and more careful preparation, into wounds believed at risk of festering, its own real, if then unexplained, power to discourage the growth of harmful organisms doing quiet. Genuine work long before anyone possessed the word bacteria to describe what it was actually doing. So weed, gathered along the tide line after a storm had loosened it from the rocks below, found its way into a smaller number of coastal remedies, valued for wound dressing in communities that lived close enough to the shore to gather it fresh. Its cool, slightly slippery texture offering the same soothing, moisture-holding comfort a modern hospital dressing is still designed, in its own more sophisticated way, to provide. And the sea itself, simply as sea air, breathed deeply on a walk along the shore, was recommended, in later medieval English medical writing, that very likely preserves an older folk conviction, reaching back into this earlier period, as genuinely beneficial to a weak chest or a lingering cough, a piece of advice that a great many English seaside towns would still, many centuries later, build an entire industry of gentle convalescent tourism upon, sending the unwell to breathe exactly the same salt-tinged air that a fen-edged or inland household could only reach by a long, deliberate journey. Fishing communities along the English coast held their own small, particular body of charm and custom besides, addressed to the safety of a boat setting out onto open water and to a good and bountiful catch, offered in exactly the same spirit, and very often in exactly the same alliterative rhythm as the charms we have already gathered tonight for a safe journey by land, or a healthy harvest from the field. One more small regional branch of the very same wide, patient tree of belief and careful, hopeful ceremony that has held the whole of this evening together. Let us rest a while longer, too, on the smallest members of every household, since children's health occupied a very large share of any healer's attention, and a number of complaints were understood, in this tradition, as belonging particularly to the young. Teething was watched over with real care, a fretful, feverish infant cutting its first teeth soothed with a little honey rubbed gently on the gum, or with a small piece of a soft root, sometimes licorice brought in through trade, sometimes a plainer local root, given to the child to chew upon, offering a gentle pressure against the swollen gum, very much like the teething rings still given to infants today. Worms common in children, then far more than in adults, given how readily a small child's curious hands carried dirt and food together to the mouth, were treated with the same wormwood we met earlier in the Dooryard Garden, its bitterness disguised, wherever possible, in honey, and with tansy, a related bitter herb valued for exactly the same purpose across many centuries of English household practice that followed. A harsh, barking cough in a small child, the complaint later English speech would come to call croup, was met with warm steam, the child held or seated close by a pot of gently boiling water, infused with horehound or coltsfoot, the same warm, moist air a modern household might still turn to instinctively for exactly the same complaint and colic, the wind and crying that so often troubled the very smallest infants, was answered with dill water, the mild, warm, faintly sweet preparation whose very name, in later English, would come to lend itself directly to the modern word gripe water, still sold today in chemist shops for precisely the same small, ordinary, ancient purpose. A sickly or slow-to-thrive infant was often given goat's milk where it could be obtained, believed to be gentler and easier to digest than cow's milk, and was, above almost everything else, kept warm, kept close to its mother, and watched over with the same patient, attentive, unhurried care that runs through every single remedy we have gathered together tonight. From the great manuscript on its monastery shelf to the smallest child asleep, at last, in its own mother's arms beside the fire. It is worth resting, too, for a moment, on how a healer in this old world was actually thanked for her care since coin. Though it certainly existed and certainly circulated across Anglo Saxon England, was often the least important part of what changed hands between a grateful household and the woman or the monk who had sat up through a long, difficult night at a sick bed. Payment came, very often, in kind, a portion of the harvest, a length of woven cloth, a share of the autumn's honey or the spring's first lambs, or simply in the promise of help returned in turn when the healer's own household one day faced its own hard season. A meal offered and a bed by the fire for a traveling healer passing through was itself a form of payment, freely given and freely received. And a wise woman known and trusted across an entire district might find herself owed, in this quiet, informal way, a whole web of small favors and small debts spread across every household she had ever helped, a kind of standing, unspoken insurance built not from coin at all, but from years of patient, remembered kindness. This way of paying for care, diffuse, reciprocal, and built on memory and trust rather than on any fixed and formal price, mirrors, in its own quiet fashion, everything else we have learned tonight about how deeply woven together this whole tradition was: medicine and community, healing and neighborliness, never quite separated from one another the way a modern invoice or a modern insurance form might now insist upon. A healer's true reward, more often than any single payment in coin or in kind, was simply the accumulated trust of her whole community, earned patiently, one careful visit at a time, exactly as every remedy in her whole store had itself been earned, patiently, one careful season at a time, across a great many years, and passed down, in the end, to whoever would come after her, ready to begin the same slow, careful, generous work all over again. One further quiet habit of mind ran underneath a great many of the choices we have walked through tonight, a habit later scholars, looking back across the whole of medieval and early modern folk medicine, would come to call the doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant's own appearance, its color, its shape, the very form of its leaf or its root, offered a kind of natural clue, placed there by a careful and orderly creation, pointing toward the particular part of the body or the particular illness it was best suited to treat. A plant with a yellow flower or a yellow sap was watched with particular interest for complaints of the liver and of jaundice, since jaundice itself turned the skin and the eyes a similar yellow, and it seemed only reasonable, within this old way of thinking, that a like color should answer a like trouble. A red plant, or a plant that bled a red sap when its stem was cut, was considered especially suited to complaints of the blood, to wounds, and to the easing of an overabundant or an overheated humor, red answering red in exactly the same intuitive, patterned way that yellow answered yellow. Walnut kernels, with their folded, wrinkled, unmistakably brain-like shape once cracked open from the shell, were widely thought, across a broad sweep of medieval folk tradition that very likely touched Anglo Saxon practice as well, to hold some particular benefit for troubles of the head and the mind. Their very form read as a kind of quiet signature left behind for a patient enough observer to notice and to trust. Comfrey's own knitted, fibrous root structure was read, in this same spirit, as a signature pointing toward its use in knitting bone and closing wound. The very name knitbone carrying the doctrine right there inside it, plain for anyone to hear. And the low, ground-hugging habit of self-heal and of certain other small, creeping plants was itself sometimes taken as a signature of quiet, humble, steady strength, exactly the kind of gentle, unglamorous, patient power this whole tradition prized above almost any other quality a remedy could possess. It would be easy, hearing all of this now, to dismiss the doctrine of signatures as simple, wishful thinking, a pattern imagined where none truly existed, and in a great many individual cases, that dismissal would very likely be fair, and yet it reflects, even in its overreach, the very same deep, patient, attentive relationship with the natural world that produced every genuinely useful remedy we have gathered together tonight, a conviction that the world was not random or indifferent, but ordered and legible, and worth the closest possible attention, a conviction that, however imperfectly, it was sometimes applied, kept an entire tradition of healers looking closely, generation after generation, at the leaf, the root, the color, and the shape of everything growing around them. And it was that same close, patient looking, sustained across so many centuries, that eventually did uncover, again and again, the small true things folded quietly among the larger guesses, the willow bark that truly eased a fever, the comfrey that truly helped a bone to knit, the honey and garlic salve that truly, 1,000 years later, defeated a modern hospital's most stubborn bacteria. Let us rest, finally, on the plain, physical texture of this whole vanished world, since it is easy, hearing so many names and so many remedies gathered together across a single long night, to lose sight of how quiet, how dim, and how genuinely slow the whole of daily life actually was for the people who built this tradition. There was no artificial light beyond the low flame of a rushlight or, on the rarest occasions, a true wax candle, and the working day itself was governed almost entirely by the rise and the fall of the sun, long and full in high summer, short and huddled close to the fire through the depth of winter. Sound itself traveled differently in a world without engines or machinery of any kind. The loudest ordinary noises a rushing stream, a blacksmith's hammer heard faintly from a neighboring settlement, the wind moving through a stand of trees, or the low, steady murmur of a household's own voices settling toward evening. Exactly the kind of unhurried, textured quiet that this whole tradition of healing grew up inside, and exactly the kind of quiet, if you have let yourself sink properly into it tonight, that you yourself have very likely been resting inside for a good while now. Distance, too, was measured differently. A day's walk, the basic unit, by which nearly everything was reckoned, a healer's whole working world, often no larger than the handful of villages she could reasonably reach and return from within a single day or two, and a truly long journey, the kind that carried pepper and frankincense and wine across the whole width of a continent, was undertaken rarely, by relatively few people, and remembered, told and retold, for years afterward. It was a world built at walking pace, at growing pace, at the slow, unhurried pace of a fire, built up from a single spark and tended, patiently hour after hour, through a long winter's night. And it is that same slow walking, growing, tending pace that we have tried to honor all this long night in the telling of it, so that wherever your own mind has wandered tonight, among manuscripts or charms or gardens or the low, watchful elder tree. It has wandered there slowly and gently and without any hurry at all. Think, for one last moment, of everything that had to hold together quietly, patiently, and without any single dramatic event at all, for even one of tonight's small facts to reach you. A healer had to notice, once, that a particular leaf eased a particular pain, and had to trust that noticing enough to try it again the following year, and the year after that, before she could ever pass it on with any real confidence to a daughter or a neighbor. A monk had to sit for long hours by a narrow window, copying out, letter by careful letter, words in a language that was not even fully his own, onto a skin that had itself first to be raised and slaughtered and scraped and stretched and dried before a single word could be written upon it at all. A manuscript, once finished, had to survive fire and flood and the ordinary slow decay of 30 or 40 generations of careless or indifferent hands, tucked away in a chest, forgotten for a while, rediscovered, valued again, moved to a safer shelf, copied once more before the original grew too fragile to be read. And a modern scholar, many centuries later, had to be curious enough and patient enough to sit with that same old page, decode its faded ink, and carry its small, quiet knowledge forward, once again, into an ordinary evening exactly like this one. None of that long chain required anything sudden or dramatic at all. It required only the same quality that this entire tradition has asked of you tonight: patience, offered freely, generation after generation, by people who mostly never knew, and never could have known, that a stranger many centuries later would ever sit quietly in the dark and listen to what they had so carefully gathered and so carefully written down. And now, tonight, you have. Before we come, at last, gently, to the very end of this long, slow walk together, let us rest for a few final minutes on something quieter still, the words themselves, since a surprising number of them have traveled all the way from that old cottage into your own ordinary speech tonight, without your ever once noticing they had made the journey. The very word leech, before it ever attached itself to the small dark creature of the pond, meant simply healer, coming from an old root that also gave the Anglo Saxons the word lace-dom, or leechdom, meaning the whole art and practice of healing, and lib, a shorter, older word carrying the double sense of both medicine and, depending entirely on the measure and the intent behind it, poison as well. The very same careful, narrow line between help and harm that we walked through so carefully earlier tonight, folded here directly into a single ancient word. Wort we have already met many times over. Mugwort and liverwort, and the St. John's wort still sold today, in health shops that have very little idea, most of them, quite how old the word growing on their own shelf label truly is, simply meant plant or root, and the countless wort names still scattered across the English countryside, spleenwort and figwort and woundwort among them, are themselves a kind of living fossil record, each name a small fragment of exactly the tradition we have spent tonight exploring, preserved not in any manuscript at all, but in the ordinary, everyday name of an ordinary hedgerow plant. Salve, the very word for the healing ointment we have made and applied so many times together tonight, comes from an old root meaning simply to heal or to save, closely related, in fact, to the modern word salvation itself, a lovely small reminder that in this old world the healing of a wound and the saving of a soul were never felt to be entirely separate ideas, both reaching, from slightly different directions, toward the very same hope of being made whole. Charm itself, so central to nearly everything we have heard tonight, arrived into English from a Latin root, carmen, meaning simply song, the very same root that gives us the modern word carol, a quiet reminder that a healing charm and a Christmas carol share, at their deepest linguistic root, exactly the same idea, words given shape and rhythm and sung aloud, because sound itself was trusted to carry real power out into the world. And galdur, the Old English word the 9 herbs, charm itself uses for its own singing, its own spoken formula, is built from the very same old root that gives modern English the word yell, a small, striking reminder of just how much vocal force and vocal presence this old healing tradition expected its charms to carry, sung, not whispered, out across the sick room and out into the open air beyond it. Perhaps loveliest of all, though, is a small cluster of words that have traveled the whole distance from that old world into your own language tonight, so completely disguised that almost no one, hearing them spoken in perfectly ordinary conversation, would ever guess their shared and rather beautiful origin. The Old English word howl, meaning simply whole, or sound, or entire, sits at the very root of an entire small family of modern English words that a listener would never normally think to place together at all. It gives us heal, quite directly, the mending of a wound back into wholeness. It gives us health itself, and it gives us the old greeting hail, still faintly remembered in the phrase hail and hearty. And, remarkably, it gives us holy as well, the very same ancient root branching, over many centuries, into both the mending of a broken body and the sacredness of a consecrated place, as though the Old English tongue itself had never quite drawn the sharp line between physical healing and spiritual wholeness that a more modern way of speaking would later insist upon, keeping instead buried quietly inside 3 or 4 perfectly ordinary words that you yourself have very likely spoken at some point in your own life, the whole gentle, blended philosophy of this entire tradition, medicine and blessing, herb and prayer, wound and soul, all resting, still, on exactly the same small, ancient word. It is a fitting thought to close on, here in the last quiet minutes of this long night, that you have been carrying pieces of this old world with you the entire time, hidden inside perfectly ordinary words you use without a second thought, and that every time you have wished someone well, or spoken of feeling whole again after an illness, or simply said, without thinking about it at all, that you hoped to heal, you have been speaking, in your own way, a small fragment of the very same old charm we have spent this whole evening walking through together. Let your whole body settle now, heavy and warm and still, as we come at last gently to the very end of this long, slow walk together. Let your mind travel back now, one final time, to that low cottage at the edge of the fen, where we began this long night together, its thatch soft and grey-green with moss, its dooryard fenced against the wandering goats, its single thread of smoke still rising, slow and unhurried, from the hole in its roof. It is evening now in the cottage, the same cottage we visited in the pale grey light before dawn, so many hours of this quiet night ago, and the healer who lives there has come in from the garden, her hands still faintly green from the day's gathering, and she is settling herself, at last, beside her own low fire, exactly as we ourselves are settling now, wherever it is you happen to be resting. On the shelf above her sits everything we have gathered together tonight. There is the memory of the great Leechbook, its careful head-to-foot arrangement, its garlic and onion and wine and bile salve that would, so many centuries later, defeat a bacteria no one in her lifetime could ever have imagined. There is the smaller, stranger Lacnunga, its charm against the dwarf fever, its charm against the troublesome wen, its long protective blessing for the traveller setting out at dawn. There is the 9 herbs charm itself, mugwort and waybread, and the plant called stoon, a torlaith and mathen, nettle and crab-apple, chervil and fennel, each one named and honoured in its turn, each one carrying, still, some small remembered portion of an old serpent struck by an old god's 9 glory twigs. There is the old English herbarium, its careful drawings of 100 plants, and its stranger companion text of animal medicine, and the quiet, careful calendars that told her which days favoured the opening of a vein, and which did not. There is the wise woman's own long chain of teaching, passed to her by an older woman before her exactly as she will, in time, pass it to a younger woman after. And there is the whole careful ceremony of gathering, the silence, the correct hand, the correct hour, the small spoken thanks offered to the earth itself, before any root was ever pulled from it. There is the Dooryard Garden just outside her door, rue and sage and fennel and dill, betony gathered in August, comfrey for the break and the wound, southernwood against the moth, wormwood for the worm, and the elder standing watchful at the garden's edge, never once cut without a word of courtesy spoken first. There is the whole warm, homely world of the hearth, the posset and the horehound tea, the poultice and the burn leaf, the warm dal and the rendered fat, ordinary remedies needing no manuscript at all, only patient generations of watching what truly helped. There is the strange and gentle world of elf-shot, the mighty women riding across the hill, the charm that turned the invisible spear aside, the old flint arrowheads gathered afterward and kept as a shield against further harm. There is the church, arriving gradually across these same centuries and folding itself gently around every one of these old charms rather than sweeping them away. Christ's name settling into a line where Woden's name had stood before, the sign of the cross added, quietly, to a gesture and a rhythm far older than the missionaries themselves. There is the honey, sweetening every bitter draught, closing every open wound, and the small custom of walking out to the hive to share the household's news, a birth, a marriage, and, in time, a death, so that the bees themselves would never feel forgotten. There is the wax, binding 100 separate herbs into one stable salve, holding, tablet after patient tablet, the very first written traces of everything we have heard tonight, and lighting, at the very last, the small steady flame by which a tired healer might read her own notes long after the rest of her household had gone quietly to sleep. There are the small stones gathered from the riverbed, and the warm amber traded up from a distant shore, and the careful count of 3 and of 9 repeated correctly every single time, because a charm said the wrong number of times was felt in this whole careful tradition, not to be quite properly said at all. There is the law itself, patiently itemizing the worth of a lost tooth and a lost finger, doing its careful best to answer the plain fact of human injury with order rather than with vengeance. There is the caution around hemlock and around henbane, held always at arm's length, respected for its danger, exactly as its cousins were trusted for their help. There is the toothache eased with clove, and the headache eased with betony. The fever answered with willow bark and, stranger still, with a small spider sealed carefully in its nutshell, and the long hours of childbirth eased with mugwort and a blessed girdle and the steady, practiced presence of women who had already walked that same hard road themselves. There is the poppy handled with such very great care, and the gentler lettuce and valerian and chamomile offered instead, and the quiet prayer said just before the fire was banked for the night, asking only for an untroubled sleep and a safe waking to follow it. There is the whole wide turning of the seasons, spring's cleansing green and summer's harvest, and autumn's dug root and winter's patient store, and the long trade roads reaching out from this one small cottage all the way to the pepper and the frankincense and the wine of a much warmer, much more distant world. All of it sits quietly on her shelf tonight, and all of it, every single piece, was gathered across many centuries and by many patient hands for exactly the same reason. Someone, somewhere, was in pain, or afraid, or simply cold and unwell on a long dark night very much like this one, and someone else, a mother, a monk, a wise woman, a traveling healer passing through on a muddy road, cared enough to try to help, and remembered what helped, and told someone else in turn, so that the next time, and the time after that, help would already be waiting, close at hand, on a low shelf beside a low fire, exactly where it was needed. The healer in the cottage banks her own fire now, covering the last of the embers carefully with ash to keep them alive until morning, and she blows out her single rushlight, and the small room settles into a warm, thick, gentle darkness, and somewhere above the thatch the same wide sky that watched over every single remedy we have gathered tonight, the moon in its slow waxing and waning, the same stars that have looked down on this low green island for far, far longer than any of its people, turns on, patient and unhurried, exactly as it always has. If your own eyes have grown heavy by now, and I hope very much that they have, then that is exactly, entirely the point of this whole long, slow evening together. There is nothing more for you to remember, and nothing more that needs to be understood before you can properly rest. The manuscripts are closed now, and the garden gate is latched, and the fire is banked, and the whole long night's gathering, every plant and every charm, and every small quiet kindness we have walked through together can simply be set down now, gently, the way the healer herself has just set down her own tired hands beside her own low fire. Let your breath grow slow and deep and easy. Let your shoulders soften fully into whatever is holding you, the mattress, the pillow, the warm weight of the blanket. Let the whole long story we have walked through together tonight, the fen and the cottage, the Leechbook and the Lacnunga, the 9 herbs and the 9 worlds, the honey and the wax and the low, watchful elder tree, grow slow and dim and very far away now, drifting gently backward into the same quiet dark that has held every single night this old tradition ever tended anyone through. There is nothing more asked of you now except to rest. The lamp in that old cottage is out, and the ashes are banked, and the whole house has gone quiet and still and warm, and somewhere, very close by, your own eyes are doing exactly the same thing, growing heavier and heavier and heavier still. Sleep well tonight. Let this whole slow gathering of old cures and old kindnesses settle over you like the softest blanket this old apothecary keeps, and let yourself sink gently and completely down into a long, deep, thoroughly restful sleep. The quiet apothecary will be here again soon, with the lamp lit and a new shelf of quiet remedies waiting, whenever you wish to return. For now, though, there is only this: rest deep, sleep long, and let the whole warm dark carry you gently all the way through until morning.